From King ZHOU of Shang's legendary wine pool banquets to Louis XV's hidden PARC-AUX-CERFS of secret mistresses, this is a dark yet fascinating journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how an ancient Chinese ruler turned a whole lake into wine and meat, and move deeper into why a French monarch built a prassing lake, private village, for his companions. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. Wine pools, meat forests, King ZHOU. In the fading light of ancient China, where the Yellow River wound through fertile plains like a golden serpent, there stood a palace that would become legend for all the wrong reasons. The year was somewhere around the 11th century before Christ, and in the magnificent city of ZHOU, the last king of the Shang dynasty held court in halls that reeked of wine and echoed with the laughter of the damned. King ZHOU's name, now synonymous with excess, was not born a monster. History whispers that in his youth he possessed a keen mind and formidable strength. Ancient texts speak of a man who could bend iron bars with his bare hands and whose intellect could unravel the most complex diplomatic puzzles. But power, that most intoxicating of drugs, would transform this promising prince into a creature of such legendary depravity that his name would be spoken in hushed tones for 3,000 years. The transformation began, as so many royal falls do, with a woman. Her name was Daji, and she entered the palace like a fever dream made flesh. The chronicles describe her as possessing a beauty so profound it could make grown men weep, with eyes that held secrets darker than midnight and a voice that could charm birds from trees. Whether she was the fox spirit of later folklore, or simply a woman who understood the terrible power of desire, Daji would become the architect of an empire's downfall. Under her influence, ZHOU began to reshape his kingdom into a playground of the flesh. The most famous of his innovations, and the one that would echo through histories, was the creation of what court historians would euphemistically call the lake of wine and forest of roast meat. Picture, if you will, an artificial lake, filled not with water, but with the finest rice wine the kingdom could produce. The liquid gleamed amber in the torchlight, its surface occasionally disturbed by courtiers who would row naked across its intoxicating waters in boats carved from precious jade. Surrounding this alcoholic lake, ZHOU ordered the construction of a forest unlike any the world had ever seen. Where nature might have placed trees, the king's artisans hung massive cuts of roasted meat from towering poles. Whole oxen, glazed pigs, and exotic birds dangled like grotesque fruit, their fat dripping into channels that fed back into the wine below. The air hung heavy with the scent of cooking flesh and fermented grain, a perfume that spoke of appetite without restraint. Here, in this carnival of excess, ZHOU would hold court with Daji at his side. The royal couple would recline on silk cushions, while hundreds of naked courtiers cavorted in the wine below, their bodies glistening with alcohol and grease. Servants would slice meat directly from the hanging carcasses, feeding the revelers by hand like exotic birds. The king himself would often disrobe and wade into the wine, Daji beside him, their bodies entwined as they sampled the flesh and drink that surrounded them. But the meat forest held darker secrets than mere gluttony. ZHOU, perhaps inspired by Daji's whispered suggestions, began to use these gatherings as theaters for increasingly elaborate cruelties. Those who displeased him might find themselves bound to the meat poles, forced to hang alongside the roasted carcasses as entertainment for the wine-soaked crowd below. Court officials who raised concerns about the kingdom's neglected borders or empty granaries would be invited to special feasts where they themselves became part of the menu, their screams mixing with the laughter of the debauched. Nobility. The most horrific of ZHOU's innovations was a bronze pillar that he had constructed in the center of his pleasure ground. This pillar, which the king called his PAOX-CERFS, or roasting pillar, was hollow and could be filled with burning coals until its surface glowed red-hot. Victims, often those who had committed the crime of moral objection, would be forced to embrace this burning column while the court watched from their wine-soaked revelries. ZHOU would applaud their dancing agony as merely another form of entertainment, their death screams no different from the musicians' melodies. As news of these atrocities spread beyond the palace walls, the kingdom began to fracture. Noble families who had served the Shang for generations found themselves faced with an impossible choice: participate in ZHOU's degradations or risk becoming part of the evening's entertainment. Many chose a third option: secret rebellion. In dimly lit chambers far from the palace, they began to whisper of a young lord from the west, a man named Wu, who claimed to represent a new way of ruling, a dynasty called ZHOU that would restore order to the chaos. The historical Wu was likely as politically motivated as any conqueror, but his propagandists would paint him as heaven's chosen instrument to end the Shang's depravity. This narrative served the new ZHOU dynasty well. What better justification for revolution than the overthrow of a king who had transformed his palace into a brothel and his kingdom into a slaughterhouse? But late at night, when the wine had been drained and the meat had been devoured, even King ZHOU might have felt the weight of what he had become. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Daji lay sleeping beside him on silk sheets stained with wine and worse, did he remember the promising young prince he had once been? Did he understand that every excess, every cruelty, every moment of unchecked appetite was another crack in the foundation of his throne? The end, when it came, was swift and brutal. The ZHOU forces swept through the kingdom like a cleansing fire, and King ZHOU's final act was to climb to the highest tower of his palace, wrap himself in jade and precious stones, and throw himself into the flames. Whether this was an act of cowardice or a final gesture of defiance, history does not say. But as the smoke rose from the burning palace, it carried with it the scent of wine and roasted meat, the last perfume of a dynasty that had drunk too deeply from the cup of its own desires. The wine pools were drained, the meat forests torn down, and the bronze pillar melted into something useful. But the story remained, passed down through generations as a warning about the price of unchecked appetite. In the gentle darkness of 3 millennia later, we can still hear the echo of that ancient excess, a reminder that even the mightiest throne can be toppled by the simple inability to say enough. The pleasure boat emperor, Caligula. 4 centuries after the death of Christ, when Roman eagles cast their shadows across the known world, a young man ascended to the throne of the greatest empire in human history. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, but history would remember him by his childhood nickname Caligula, little boots earned during his early years, following the legions with his father. In those innocent days, soldiers would smile at the sight of the boy in his miniature military sandals. None could have imagined that this charming child would become the monster who nearly brought Rome to its knees. The transformation of Caligula from beloved prince to depraved tyrant remains one of history's most chilling metamorphoses. When he took power in 37 CE, the Roman people erupted in celebration. Here, at last, was relief from the paranoid gloom of Tiberius, whose final years had been marked by treason trials and executions. The young emperor began his reign by releasing political prisoners, restoring the popular assemblies, and giving generous bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. For a brief shining moment, it seemed that Rome had found its golden prince. But something went wrong in the first year of his reign. Whether it was the sudden intoxication of absolute power, a mental illness that had lurked dormant in his bloodline, or simply the corruption that comes from having every desire instantly gratified, Caligula began to change. The transformation was gradual. At first, small cruelties, masked as jokes, increasingly bizarre demands disguised as imperial whims. But by the end of his first year in power, the man who had once been Rome's hope had become its nightmare. The emperor's most infamous indulgences took place on the waters of Lake Nemi, nestled in the Alban Hills south of Rome. Here, Caligula ordered the construction of floating palaces that defied both engineering sense and moral comprehension. These were not mere ships but aquatic temples to hedonism, each one larger than most buildings and decorated with a luxury that would have made Cleopatra herself blush. The largest of these vessels stretched over 300 feet in length, its hull plated with bronze and its decks paved with multicolored marble imported from every corner of the empire. But the true marvel was not in their construction, but in their purpose. These floating palaces served as theaters for the emperor's most elaborate sexual performances, staged for an audience of terrified senators and delighted courtiers. The ship's main decks were converted into bedchambers open to the sky, where Caligula would conduct his affairs with a shamelessness that shocked even Rome's jaded nobility. He would appear naked before his guests, often with multiple partners of both sexes, treating the horrified senators to spectacles that redefined the very concept of imperial dignity. The emperor's appetite knew no boundaries of gender, age, or family relation. He openly boasted of his sexual conquests among the wives and daughters of Rome's elite, often demanding that husbands bring their wives to his floating orgies as proof of their loyalty. Those who refused might find themselves charged with treason. Those who complied watched their marriages dissolve in the warm waters of Lake Nemi, while their emperor cavorted with their spouses mere feet away. But it was Caligula's relationship with his sister Drusilla that truly scandalized Rome. In a society where even the rumor of incest could destroy a political career, the emperor flaunted his physical relationship with his sister like a badge of honor. He would appear with her at public events, their bodies pressed together in poses that left no doubt about the nature of their bond. When she died suddenly in 38 CE, possibly poisoned by rivals, though some whispered the emperor himself had grown tired of her, Caligula declared her a goddess and ordered the entire empire to worship her memory. The aftermath of Drusilla's death marked the beginning of Caligula's complete descent into madness. Grief mixed with guilt and power to create a creature that was no longer quite human. He began to appear in public dressed as various gods, demanding that temples throughout the empire replace their statues with images of his own face. In the floating palaces of Lake Nemi, he would conduct elaborate ceremonies where he played the role of Jupiter, complete with thunderbolts crafted by the empire's finest artisans and a mechanical device that could produce the sound of thunder. But even these blasphemous theatrics paled beside the emperor's more intimate cruelties. He developed a game where he would invite prominent Romans to dinner aboard his pleasure barges, then force them to watch while he violated their wives and children. Those who showed any sign of distress might find themselves thrown overboard, their screams mixing with the gentle lapping of waves against the marble hulls. The emperor would then turn to his remaining guests with a smile, commenting on the beauty of the evening and the quality of the wine as if nothing had happened. The floating palaces also served as venues for the emperor's increasingly elaborate punishments. He would stage mock naval battles using convicted criminals as combatants, but these fights were fixed to ensure maximum suffering rather than entertainment. Prisoners might be sewn into the skins of wild animals and set loose on the decks while hunting dogs pursued them, or forced to fight while chained to weights that made victory impossible. The emperor would recline on silk cushions with his current favorites, feeding them grapes while human beings died for their amusement mere yards away. As word of these floating atrocities spread throughout Rome, the emperor's support began to crumble. Senators who had once competed for invitations to imperial parties now invented excuses to avoid them. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor's person, began to whisper among themselves about their duty to protect Rome itself. Even the common people, who had initially loved their young emperor, began to mutter darkly about the strange lights that flickered over Lake Nemi on certain nights and the screams that travelers claimed to hear on the wind. In the end, it was not the people who brought down Caligula, but his own guards. On a cold January morning in 41 CE, as the emperor returned from theatrical games at his palace, a group of Praetorian officers cornered him in a narrow corridor. The man who had once played God among the floating palaces of Lake Nemi died like any mortal stabbed repeatedly by men who had simply grown tired of his monstrous appetites. The floating palaces were stripped of their treasures and allowed to sink into the dark waters of Lake Nemi, where they would rest for nearly 2,000 years before modern archaeologists raised them again to the light. But by then, they were empty shells, the marble stained, the bronze corroded, the silk and flesh long since returned to dust. What remained was only the memory of what unchecked power could become when wielded by a mind that had forgotten the difference between desire and duty. In the quiet hours after midnight, when Lake Nemi lies still beneath the Italian stars, locals still claim they can sometimes see lights flickering beneath the water ghostly, reminders of an emperor who confused his own appetites with the will of the gods, and in doing so, nearly drowned an empire in his own degradation. Songs of fire, perfume, NERO. In the golden hour, when afternoon surrenders to evening, when shadows grow long and the air fills with the scent of olive blossoms, there once stood a palace unlike any the world had ever seen. This was the Domus Aurea, Nero's golden house, a monument to imperial excess that sprawled across 3 of Rome's 7 hills like a beautiful cancer. Here, in chambers that rotated with the sun and ceilings that showered guests with flower petals and perfumed water, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian line would write the final act of his dynasty in blood, music, and fire. Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, was barely 17 when he took the throne in 54 CE, his path to power paved with his mother Agrippina's ambitions and his stepfather Claudius's suspicious death. In those early years, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the prefect Burrus, young Nero showed promise. He lowered taxes, expanded the rights of slaves, and gave generous aid to cities struck by natural disasters. Rome dared to hope that this handsome, artistic youth might restore the dignity that Caligula had squandered. But power, that most corrupting of forces, would transform the promising boy into a creature whose appetites would consume everything he touched. The emperor's obsession with artistic performance was apparent from his earliest days on the throne. While previous rulers might have patronized the arts from a respectful distance, Nero threw himself into music and theater with the passionate intensity of a lover. He spent hours practicing the lyre, his fingers growing calloused as he pursued perfect pitch with the dedication of a professional musician. He wrote poetry with genuine skill and performed on stage with an enthusiasm that both charmed and horrified Rome's conservative elite, who believed that no emperor should demean himself by appearing before the public like a common entertainer. But it was when the emperor began to combine his artistic passions with his sexual appetites that Rome truly began to understand what sort of man now wore the purple. The transformation began slowly, almost imperceptibly, with private concerts in the palace, where the audience was carefully selected for their beauty rather than their station. These intimate gatherings, initially focused on music, gradually evolved into something far more elaborate and disturbing. The centerpiece of Nero's domestic arrangements was his relationship with Poppaea Sabina, a woman whose beauty was legendary even in an empire accustomed to stunning women. She was married to Otho, one of Nero's closest friends, when the emperor first laid eyes on her at a dinner party. What followed was a courtship that scandalized even Rome's jaded aristocracy, not for its adultery, which was commonplace, but for its shameless public display. Nero would appear at the theater with both his wife Octavia and his mistress Poppaea, seating them on either side of him while he performed, as if daring the crowd to comment on the arrangement. When Poppaea became pregnant, Nero's solution was characteristically brutal and direct. He had Octavia executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and married his pregnant mistress in a ceremony that combined traditional Roman rituals with theatrical elements of his own devising. The wedding feast lasted for 3 days and nights, with the emperor himself providing the entertainment. singing love songs to his new bride, while guests reclined on couches arranged to form a giant heart shape, visible from the palace's upper floors. But Nero's appetites extended far beyond conventional adultery. The emperor began to surround himself with beautiful young men and women who served as both courtiers and concubines, their roles shifting depending on his mood and the evening's entertainment. These favorites would join him in elaborate bathing rituals that lasted for hours, their bodies oiled and perfumed, while the emperor composed verses celebrating their physical perfection. The palace's marble halls echoed with music and laughter, but also with sounds that made even Rome's most sophisticated citizens blush. The most shocking of Nero's arrangements involved a young man named Sporus, a freedman whose resemblance to the deceased Poppaea was so striking that the emperor became obsessed with him. In a ceremony that defied every tradition of Roman masculinity, Nero had Sporus castrated and then married him in a public ceremony complete with wedding veil and dowry. The bride was paraded through Rome's streets, while citizens watched in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing marriage, sacrifice, or madness. Nero's domestic innovations were matched by his architectural ambitions. The Golden House was designed not merely as a residence, but as a complete environment for pleasure, its rooms arranged to facilitate the emperor's increasingly elaborate entertainments. The famous rotating dining room was equipped with mechanisms that could shower guests with flower petals, spray them with perfumed water, or even release small birds that would flutter around the chamber while diners fed each other delicacies by hand. But it was in the palace's private chambers that Nero's true nature revealed itself. Here, away from the public eye, the emperor would stage elaborate scenarios that combined his love of theater with his sexual appetites. He might appear as Apollo, complete with golden hair and lyre, while his favorites played the roles of various mythological figures in dramas that inevitably concluded with the emperor's triumph over gods and mortals alike. These performances could last for hours, with the emperor insisting on multiple encores, while his exhausted audience pretended enthusiasm they no longer felt. The palace's most notorious feature was its secret passages and hidden chambers, designed to allow the emperor to move unseen between rooms and observe his guests without their knowledge. Nero would use these hidden vantage points to study the private conversations and intimate moments of his courtiers, gathering information that he might later use for blackmail or simply for his own amusement. Some whispered that he had certain chambers equipped with mechanisms that could introduce various substances into the air perfumes that heightened sexual desire, or other drugs that made guests more susceptible to suggestion. As his reign progressed, Nero's entertainments became increasingly elaborate and dangerous. He began staging private gladiatorial contests in the palace courtyard, but with a twist. Combatants were often prominent Romans who had fallen from favor, forced to fight for their lives, while the emperor composed songs about their struggles. These bloody spectacles were followed by elaborate feasts, where the survivors were expected to thank their host for the privilege of nearly dying for his amusement. The Great Fire of 64 CE, which destroyed much of Rome, provided Nero with the ultimate theatrical opportunity. While the city burned, the emperor reportedly stood on the palace roof, dressed in his stage costume and singing his own composition about the fall of Troy. Whether he actually started the fire remains a matter of historical debate, but there's no question that he used the disaster as inspiration for his art, composing epic verses about the beauty of destruction, while thousands of his subjects lost everything they owned. In the aftermath of the fire, Nero's response revealed both his artistic ambitions and his complete disconnection from reality. Rather than focusing on relief efforts, he used the cleared land to expand his Golden House, creating an estate that encompassed roughly a third of the city. The new palace featured artificial lakes, vineyards, and pastures where exotic animals roamed freely, all designed to serve as backdrops for the emperor's increasingly elaborate pleasures. But even as he built his earthly paradise, Nero's grip on power was slipping. The Senate began to meet in secret. Provincial governors started to question imperial orders, and even the Praetorian Guard grew restless. The emperor seemed oblivious to these warning signs, lost in a world of music and flesh where his slightest whim became reality and his artistic vision mattered more than the stability of the empire. The end came swiftly in 68 CE, when word reached Rome that the Spanish legions had declared for a rival claimant. Faced with the choice between capture and suicide, Nero chose death, but even his final moments reflected his theatrical nature. As his freedmen helped him drive the dagger home, the emperor's last words were reportedly, "What an artist perishes in me," a final, tragic testament to a man who had confused his own appetites with imperial duty and had paid the ultimate price for that confusion. The Golden House was stripped of its treasures and buried beneath the construction projects of later emperors, its chambers filled with earth and its rotating mechanisms left to rust in darkness. But sometimes, on warm Roman evenings, when the air is heavy with the scent of flowers, locals claim they can still hear faint music drifting up from beneath the city streets, ghostly echoes of an emperor who loved beauty so much that he nearly destroyed an empire in pursuit of the perfect song. The violet silk high priest, Elagabalus. In the year 218 CE, when the Roman Empire stretched from the mists of Britain to the burning sands of Syria, a 14-year-old child ascended to the throne of the greatest power the world had ever known. The boy's birth name was Varius Avitus Bassianus, but he would be remembered by history as Elagabalus, named for the Syrian sun god, whose dark stone he served with a devotion that bordered on madness. In the space of 4 short years, this adolescent emperor would challenge every assumption about gender, sexuality, and religious orthodoxy that Rome held sacred, transforming the imperial palace into a temple of mysteries that scandalized even the empire's most jaded citizens. The path to power had been paved by women his grandmother Julia Maesa and his mother Julia Soamius, both possessed of formidable intelligence and ruthless ambition. They had orchestrated a military coup against the emperor Macrinus with the skill of seasoned generals, convincing the Syrian legions that young Elagabalus was the legitimate heir to the Severan dynasty. But once their puppet was installed on the throne, they discovered that the boy had developed ideas of his own ideas that would transform the very nature of Roman rule. From his earliest days in power, Elagabalus displayed a religious fervor that unnerved even his supporters. He had arrived in Rome, accompanied by the sacred black stone of Emesa, a meteorite that was believed to house the spirit of the unconquered sun god Elagabal. The emperor installed this alien deity in a magnificent temple on the Palatine Hill, directly across from the traditional seat of Roman religion, as if declaring war on the gods themselves. But it was not merely the introduction of a foreign cult that shocked Rome, it was the manner in which the young emperor served his deity. Elagabalus appeared in public, dressed in the flowing silk robes of a Syrian priest, his eyes lined with kohl and his cheeks painted with rouge that caught the light like rose petals. His hair, longer than any Roman man's should be, was arranged in elaborate curls and adorned with jewels that sparkled as he moved. When he conducted religious ceremonies, he would dance before the altar with movements that were simultaneously graceful and unsettling, his silk garments swirling around his adolescent form like colored smoke. The conservative Roman elite watched these performances with mounting horror, recognizing in them a challenge to everything they considered masculine and Roman. But the emperor's religious innovations were only the beginning of his assault on tradition. Within the palace walls, Elagabalus created a court that operated according to rules no Roman had ever imagined. He elevated his lovers, both male and female, to positions of power traditionally reserved for senators and generals, appointing them to govern provinces and command legions based on their beauty rather than their competence. His favorite, a charioteer named Hierocles, was given honors typically reserved for military heroes, while the emperor himself took the passive role in their relationship, to a reversal of sexual hierarchy that left Roman masculinity itself in question. The palace became a stage for increasingly elaborate ceremonies that combined religious ritual with theatrical performance. Elagabalus would appear before his court dressed as various goddesses, his slight frame draped in diaphanous fabrics that revealed as much as they concealed. He commissioned paintings and sculptures that depicted him as Venus, Diana, and Cybele, often with female anatomy that reflected his apparent desire to transcend the limitations of his birth sex. Court artists, terrified of refusing imperial commissions, created works that challenged the very concept of gender itself. Perhaps most shocking to Roman sensibilities was the emperor's relationship with religion and sexuality. He appointed male prostitutes to high priestly offices, arguing that those who served the gods with their bodies were holier than those who merely mouthed prayers. The sacred ceremonies of the sun god became occasions for elaborate sexual rituals, with the emperor himself often serving as both priest and offering. Roman senators, forced to attend these ceremonies as a matter of protocol, found themselves witnesses to acts that redefined the very concept of religious devotion. The emperor's matrimonial adventures provided another source of scandal. He married and divorced with a frequency that made even Rome's relaxed attitude toward marriage seem conservative. His union with Julia Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin sworn to celibacy, was perhaps his most provocative deliberate violation of one of Rome's most sacred taboos. The emperor justified this blasphemy by claiming that the marriage would produce divine children, but Rome's priests saw it as nothing less than an assault on the gods themselves. But it was Elagabalus's apparent desire to be treated as a woman that truly mystified his subjects. Court records speak of the emperor offering vast sums to any physician who could provide him with female anatomy, suggesting a longing that transcended mere sexual appetite. He would appear at state functions dressed in women's clothing, insisting that courtiers address him with feminine titles and speak of him as the empress rather than the emperor. When receiving foreign ambassadors, he would sometimes appear behind a curtain, speaking in a deliberately high voice while musicians played to mask the sound of his natural speech. The palace's domestic arrangements reflected the emperor's unconventional approach to relationships. Rather than maintaining the traditional imperial household, Elagabalus created what amounted to a religious commune where dozens of young men and women lived as both servants and devotees. These favorites were chosen for their beauty and their willingness to participate in the elaborate ceremonies that the emperor devised, rituals that combined elements of Syrian religion with Greek mystery cults and Egyptian magic. The palace's marble halls echoed with chanting and music at all hours, as if the building itself had been transformed into a living temple. The emperor's approach to governance was equally unconventional. Important state decisions were often made during religious ceremonies, with the sacred stone of Emesa consulted like an oracle before major policy announcements. Traditional Roman law was supplemented with Syrian customs that reflected the emperor's religious beliefs, including provisions that granted special status to priests and temple servants. The empire's military commanders found themselves receiving orders written on scented papyrus and sealed with wax, infused with frankincense, as if even imperial correspondence had been transformed into religious ritual. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Elagabalus's reign was his apparent indifference to the suffering his innovations caused. Romans who objected to his religious reforms might find themselves charged with sacrilege and thrown to wild beasts, while those who questioned his sexual arrangements could be accused of treason against the imperial person. The emperor seemed genuinely puzzled by his subjects' discomfort, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would object to the worship of his beautiful god or the celebration of love in all its forms. As his reign progressed, opposition began to coalesce around his cousin Alexander Severus, a more conventionally masculine youth who promised to restore traditional Roman values. Julia Maessa, the grandmother who had engineered Elagabalus's rise to power, began to have second thoughts about her protégé's radical agenda. Secret meetings were held in private homes throughout Rome, where senators and generals discussed the possibility of regime change with the careful euphemisms that kept them just short of treason. The end came suddenly in March of 222 CE, when the Praetorian Guard, finally pushed beyond their tolerance for imperial eccentricity, stormed the palace during one of the emperor's religious ceremonies. ELAGABALUS was found hiding in a latrine, dressed in his silk robes and clutching a small statue of his beloved god. The guards showed no mercy to the 18-year-old who had challenged everything they held sacred, cutting him down like any common criminal before dragging his body through the streets of Rome. His mother, Julia Soaemias, died beside him, and both bodies were thrown into the Tiber River, a final insult that denied them proper burial and suggested that their very existence had been a pollution of Roman soil. The sacred stone of Emesa was returned to Syria, the temple destroyed, and all images of the emperor ordered removed from public view. It was as if Rome was trying to erase the memory of 4 years that had challenged the very foundations of imperial civilization. But memory, like desire, proves difficult to control. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the Tiber runs dark beneath Rome's ancient bridges, some claim they can still see lights flickering in the water reflections of an emperor who dared to imagine a world where gender was fluid, love was sacred, and the gods themselves might dance in silk robes beneath the Syrian sun. Whether genius or madman, saint or sinner, Elagabalus remains a haunting reminder that even the mightiest empire cannot always contain the human heart's capacity for transformation. Arena after dark, COMMODUS. In the dying light of Rome's golden age, when the empire stretched from Scotland's misty highlands to the burning deserts of Arabia, there ruled an emperor who mistook brutality for strength and spectacle for greatness. His name was Commodus, and he would prove to be the cancer that consumed the Antonine dynasty from within, transforming the philosophical legacy of Marcus Aurelius into a theatre of blood that shocked even Rome's violence-hardened citizens. Born into unimaginable privilege as the son of the philosopher-emperor Marcus Aurelius, Commodus should have inherited wisdom along with power. His father had spent decades crafting the Meditations, those timeless reflections on duty, virtue, and the temporary nature of earthly glory. But the son who emerged from this noble lineage was a creature driven by appetites that his father's stoic philosophy could never have anticipated, appetites that would transform the imperial palace into an arena where human dignity went to die. The transformation began subtly, as moral corruption often does. In his early years as emperor, Commodus seemed content to delegate the tedious business of governance to capable administrators while he pursued his true passion, gladiatorial combat. What started as private training sessions in the palace courtyard gradually evolved into something far more sinister, as the emperor's fascination with violence began to merge with his growing sexual appetites in ways that defied both Roman tradition and human decency. The emperor's private arena, constructed in the gardens behind the palace, became the stage for entertainments that redefined the very concept of imperial leisure. Here, in a space that could accommodate perhaps 50 spectators, Commodus would stage elaborate gladiatorial contests, featuring opponents who had been chosen not for their fighting skill but for their beauty. Young men and women, selected from among the empire's most attractive slaves and prisoners, would be forced to fight while wearing minimal armor that revealed more than it protected. These private contests served multiple purposes for the emperor's twisted psyche. They satisfied his bloodlust while providing a steady supply of sexual partners chosen through a process of violent elimination. Winners might find themselves elevated to the emperor's bed, while losers faced death or worse transformation into permanent fixtures in the emperor's expanding collection of human curiosities. The arena's sand, originally imported from Egypt for its fine texture, gradually took on a permanent reddish tinge that spoke of countless small tragedies played out for one man's amusement. But it was Commodus's treatment of wounded veterans that revealed the true depths of his depravity. soldiers who had served the empire faithfully, only to return home maimed by barbarian swords or Germanic spears, found themselves dragged before the emperor for his entertainment. These men, already broken by war, were forced to fight each other, while the emperor and his favorites watched from silk-draped couches, making bets on which crippled warrior would succumb first. The irony was not lost on Rome's remaining philosophers, the son of Marcus Aurelius, who had written so eloquently about honoring those who served the common good, was now torturing them for sport. The emperor's appetite for these grotesque spectacles was matched only by his sexual voracity. Court records, preserved by administrators too frightened to refuse their duties, speak of elaborate orgies staged in the arena's underground chambers. Here, amid the cells where gladiators once prepared for combat, Commodus would retreat with his collection of favorites, men and women chosen from among the survivors of his private games. These subterranean chambers, lit by oil lamps that cast dancing shadows on blood-stained walls, became theaters for sexual performances that combined the emperor's love of violence with his insatiable physical appetites. The most disturbing of these arrangements involved his relationship with Marcia, a former slave who had somehow captured the emperor's attention and elevated herself to the position of imperial concubine. Unlike the typical powerless victims of imperial lust, Marcia wielded considerable influence over Commodus, using her sexual hold on him to orchestrate increasingly elaborate and cruel entertainments. She would appear in the arena dressed as an Amazon warrior, complete with leather armor that left little to the imagination, directing the emperor's games like a conductor leading a symphony of suffering. Under Marcia's influence, the emperor's private arena became a laboratory for new forms of cruelty. They developed elaborate scenarios where condemned prisoners would be forced to reenact famous battles or mythological scenes, but with sexual elements added that transformed heroic narratives into pornographic nightmares. The fall of Troy might be restaged with the emperor playing Achilles, and his victims forced to portray both Hector and Helen, their deaths and violations intertwined in ways that would have horrified Homer himself. But perhaps most shocking to Roman sensibilities was Commodus's decision to appear personally in the public arena, fighting as a gladiator before the empire's citizens. This was not merely a breach of imperial dignity, it was a fundamental challenge to the social order that had sustained Rome for centuries. When the emperor entered the Colosseum wearing gladiator's garb, he was not simply entertaining the masses, he was declaring that the distinction between ruler and entertainment, between sacred imperial person and common performer, no longer existed. These public appearances were carefully choreographed to ensure the emperor's victory, but they served a deeper psychological purpose. By defeating opponents in full view of Rome's citizens, Commodus was asserting his physical dominance while simultaneously degrading the imperial office. The crowd's cheers, purchased with bread and circuses, masked a deeper unease among those who understood that they were witnessing the systematic destruction of everything that had made Rome great. The emperor's domestic arrangements reflected this same collapse of traditional boundaries. The palace became a kind of gladiatorial school where young men and women competed not just for survival but for the emperor's sexual attention. Those who pleased him might find themselves elevated to positions of influence, regardless of their birth or qualifications. A particularly skilled lover might be appointed to govern a province, while a beautiful but sexually inadequate partner might find themselves back in the arena, this time fighting for their lives rather than for imperial favor. As his reign progressed, Commodus's behavior became increasingly erratic and dangerous. He began to identify himself with Hercules, appearing in public wearing lion skins and carrying clubs, as if the mythological hero's strength could somehow compensate for his own moral weakness. These theatrical appearances often preceded particularly brutal sessions in the private arena, as if the emperor needed to convince himself of his own divinity before indulging in acts that proved his humanity's complete absence. The end came from within his own household, orchestrated by the very people who had enabled his worst excesses. Marcia, perhaps finally sickened by what she had helped create, joined with other palace insiders to plan the emperor's assassination. On New Year's Eve, 192 CE, as Commodus prepared for another night of gladiatorial entertainment, his wrestling partner, Narcissus, strangled him in his bather-fitting end for a man who had confused physical dominance with imperial authority. The conspirators had acted not from moral outrage but from simple fear for their own lives, recognizing that the emperor's increasingly unpredictable behavior made everyone around him a potential victim. When word of Commodus's death spread through Rome, the reaction was not grief but relief, that the nightmare was finally over, that the arena would no longer echo with the screams of the innocent, that the imperial purple would no longer be stained with the blood of Rome's own citizens. The private arena was dismantled within days of the emperor's death, its stones scattered and its underground chambers filled with earth. But the damage to the imperial system proved more difficult to repair. The Antonine dynasty died with Commodus, and Rome would never again enjoy the stability and prosperity that had marked the reigns of Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius. In seeking to prove his strength through cruelty, Commodus had revealed only weakness, the weakness of a man who confused power with violence and who paid the ultimate price for that confusion. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the Colosseum stands empty beneath the Roman stars, locals sometimes claim they can still hear the echo of ancient cheers, ghostly reminders of an emperor who fought for applause and died for his appetite, leaving behind only the memory of what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of someone who mistakes brutality for greatness. Silk-draped towers, Emperor Yang of Sui. In the heart of ancient China, where the great rivers carved jade valleys through mountains older than memory, there once stood palaces that defied both heaven and earth in their magnificence. This was the reign of Emperor Yang of Sui, a man whose vision encompassed not merely the conquest of territory, but the transformation of an entire empire into his personal pleasure garden. In the space of 14 years, from 604 to 618 CE, this ambitious ruler would create wonders that dazzled the known world, while simultaneously sowing the seeds of his own spectacular destruction. Yang Guang, as he was known before ascending the throne, had been born into the Sui dynasty during an age of reunification, when China was slowly healing from centuries of division and warfare. His father, Emperor Wen, had laid the foundation for a stable empire through careful administration and military conquest. But the son who inherited this vast realm possessed an imagination that soared far beyond mere governance, envisioning projects that would reshape the very landscape of China according to his desires. The emperor's most audacious creation was the Grand Canal, a waterway that would eventually stretch over 1,000 miles from Beijing to Hangzhou, connecting the Yellow and Yangtze rivers in an engineering feat that rivaled the Great Wall itself. But Yang conceived of this massive project not merely as a means of transport or communication. It was to be the central artery of a pleasure network that would allow him to move between his various palaces like a god, traveling between celestial mansions. The construction of the canal revealed both the emperor's genius and his callous disregard for human suffering. Millions of workers' peasants conscripted from across the empire labored in conditions that can only be described as hellish. They dug through mountains and bridged valleys, while imperial architects planned pleasure barges that would carry the emperor and his court along the completed waterway. The contrast between the workers' misery and the luxury they were creating became one of the great ironies of Chinese history and empire, building its own tomb while dreaming of paradise. But it was not merely the scale of Yang's projects that marked his reign. It was the sensual luxury with which he surrounded every aspect of his rule. His palaces were designed as complete environments for pleasure, with gardens that bloomed year-round through careful cultivation and artificial heating. Silk pavilions dotted artificial lakes, where exotic birds from across Asia created living symphonies of color and sound. The emperor's personal apartments were decorated with murals depicting scenes from Chinese mythology, but with himself cast as the central figure in every heroic narrative. The most spectacular of Yang's innovations were the dragon boats that carried him along his canal system. These vessels were not merely transportation but floating palaces, each one larger than most buildings and equipped with luxuries that redefined the very concept of imperial travel. The largest of these boats stretched over 300 feet in length, its hull carved with dragons whose scales were inlaid with precious stones that caught the sunlight like captured fire. Multiple decks provided space for everything from throne rooms to private bedchambers, while the vessel's wake was scented with perfumes that could be smelled from miles away. But the true purpose of these floating palaces became apparent in their domestic arrangements. The emperor traveled with a carefully selected court of beautiful young women, chosen from across the empire for their ability to provide both intellectual and physical pleasure. These concubines were not merely passive ornaments, but active participants in elaborate entertainments that combined poetry, music, and sexuality in ways that would have scandalized Confucian traditionalists had they dared to speak openly about what they witnessed. During his canal journeys, Yang would stage elaborate water festivals that transformed the waterway into a theater of pleasure. Hundreds of smaller boats would accompany the imperial flotilla, each one carrying musicians, dancers, or acrobats who would perform while the emperor reclined with his favorites on silk cushions that cost more than most peasants earned in a lifetime. These floating parades would wind through the Chinese countryside for weeks at a time, stopping at specially constructed pleasure palaces where the emperor would rest between journeys. The emperor's appetite for luxury extended to every aspect of his court life. His meals were prepared by chefs trained in the cuisines of every province, with ingredients transported by imperial courier from the farthest corners of the empire. A single dinner might feature delicacies from Sichuan, Guangdong, and Jiangnan, served on dishes crafted from the finest porcelain and accompanied by wines aged in caves that had been blessed by Buddhist monks. The emperor would dine surrounded by his concubines, feeding them choice morsels by hand, while musicians played and incense burned in braziers shaped like mythological creatures. But perhaps most revealing of Yang's character was his treatment of the forced labor that made his lifestyle possible. While millions of peasants died building his canal and palaces, the emperor seemed genuinely oblivious to their suffering, as if the luxury that surrounded him had created a barrier between his consciousness and the reality of his subjects' lives. He would compose poetry, celebrating the beauty of his gardens, while families starved to pay for their construction, apparently unable to connect his pleasure with their pain. The emperor's relationship with his concubines reflected this same disconnection from consequence. He collected beautiful women with the passion of an art collector, seeking not merely physical pleasure, but the aesthetic satisfaction of surrounding himself with perfection. His harem eventually numbered in the thousands, with women chosen for their accomplishments in music, poetry, and dance, as well as their physical beauty. These women lived in luxury beyond imagination, but they were also prisoners in a golden cage, their lives entirely dependent on the emperor's changeable moods. Yang's most elaborate creation was the Western Garden in Luoyang, a pleasure complex that covered over 40 square miles and contained wonders that stretched the boundaries of both engineering and imagination. Artificial mountains rose hundreds of feet into the air, their peaks covered with snow, even in summer, through an ingenious system of ice storage. Mechanical devices created artificial weather within the garden's boundaries, so that the emperor might experience spring rain in one pavilion while enjoying autumn mists in another. Within this fantastic landscape, Yang staged entertainments that combined elements of theater, religious ritual, and sexual performance. Hundreds of courtiers would participate in elaborate scenarios drawn from Chinese literature and mythology, but with the emperor always cast as the heroic central figure. These performances might last for days, with participants changing costumes and roles, while the emperor enjoyed the spectacle from a throne that was itself a work of art. carved from jade and inlaid with gold in patterns that told the story of his dynasty's rise to power. But while Yang played in his pleasure gardens, the empire began to crumble around him. The massive cost of his projects had drained the imperial treasury, while the forced labor required for their construction had depopulated entire regions. Rebellions erupted across China as peasants, who had lost everything to the emperor's vision of beauty, finally decided that death in battle was preferable to slow starvation under imperial oppression. The emperor's response to these uprisings revealed the fundamental weakness of his character. Rather than addressing the legitimate grievances of his subjects, he retreated deeper into his world of artificial pleasure, staging ever more elaborate entertainments while his generals fought desperately to hold the empire together. He seemed incapable of understanding that the beauty he had created was built on a foundation of suffering that could not be sustained indefinitely. The end came in 618 CE, when Yang was assassinated by his own officers during a pleasure cruise in Jiangdu. These men, who had once competed for the privilege of serving in the emperor's presence, finally recognized that their ruler's appetites had become a threat to the survival of the empire itself. They found him in his private chambers aboard the dragon boat, surrounded by silk curtains and the scent of burning incense, composing verses about the eternal nature of beauty, while his empire collapsed around him. The Great Canal survived its creator, becoming one of China's most important transportation arteries and eventually earning recognition as one of the engineering marvels of the ancient world. But the pleasure palaces crumbled into ruins, their artificial gardens returning to wilderness as nature reclaimed what human ambition had briefly transformed. The dragon boats were burned or left to rot in forgotten harbors, their carved scales scattered like the dreams of the emperor who had commissioned them. In the quiet hours before dawn, when mist rises from the ancient waterways of China, boatmen sometimes claim they can see ghostly lights reflecting on the water memories of floating palaces that once carried an emperor who confused his own pleasure with the welfare of his empire, and who paid the ultimate price for that tragic misunderstanding. The canal flows on, serving the needs of practical commerce, but it carries with it the echo of more extravagant dreams. Dreams of beauty so intense that they consumed everything in their path, leaving behind only the memory of what happens when unlimited power meets unlimited appetite. Marble courts, 7 wives, Herod the Great. In the harsh and beautiful landscape of ancient Palestine, where desert winds carry the scent of frankincense and the promise of distant empires, there once ruled a king whose architectural magnificence was matched only by the darkness of his domestic arrangements. His name was Herod, called the Great by history for his building projects, but remembered in darker corners for appetites that transformed his palace into a theater of jealousy, murder, and sexual obsession that would have impressed even the most jaded Roman patricians. Born into the political chaos of the dying Roman Republic, Herod had clawed his way to power through a combination of ruthless ambition and careful attention to which way the imperial winds were blowing. He had allied himself with Mark Antony, then smoothly transferred his loyalty to Octavian when the tide of civil war turned. By 37 BCE, he found himself king of Judea under Roman protection, ruler of a realm that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, with resources enough to indulge appetites that grew more elaborate with each passing year. The foundation of Herod's empire was built on marriages, 7 of them, each one calculated to advance his political position while satisfying desires that seemed to grow more complex with age. But these were not the dynastic alliances of other monarchs, coldly negotiated and dutifully consummated. Herod approached marriage with the passionate intensity of a collector acquiring rare treasures, each wife chosen not merely for political advantage, but for the particular type of beauty or accomplishment that caught his increasingly sophisticated eye. His first wife, Doris, had been a pragmatic, choicer woman of modest birth who provided him with his eldest son, Antipater, But as Herod's power grew, so did his ambitions for more exotic pleasures. His second marriage, to Mariamne of the Hasmonean dynasty, transformed him from a calculating politician into something approaching a romantic obsessive. Mariamne possessed the kind of austere beauty that seemed to embody the ancient nobility of Israel itself, and Herod's passion for her bordered on worship. The king's relationship with Mariamne revealed the fundamental contradiction of his character, a man capable of vast architectural vision, but utterly incapable of understanding the human heart. He showered her with gifts that would have impressed Cleopatra herself. Jewelry carved from single emeralds, silks imported from the distant corners of the Silk Road, and private gardens where roses bloomed year-round through careful cultivation. But beneath this lavish devotion lay a possessiveness so intense that it gradually transformed love into something more resembling imprisonment. Herod's palace complex at Caesarea Maritima, his greatest architectural achievement, was designed as much to display his wives as to demonstrate his power. The building's central courtyard featured a series of apartments, each one decorated in the style of its occupant's homeland, creating a kind of international exhibition of feminine beauty under one vast roof. Visitors to the court would be treated to carefully choreographed entertainments, where each wife would appear in the costume of her people, performing traditional dances, while the king watched with the satisfaction of a connoisseur enjoying his collection. But it was at his fortress palace of Masada, perched impossibly on a cliff above the Dead Sea, that Herod's domestic arrangements took on their most sinister character. Here, in rooms carved from living rock and decorated with frescoes that depicted scenes of mythological seduction, the king created what amounted to a luxurious prison for wives who had fallen from favor. The palace's ingenious water system ensured that even in the desert, his apartments could be filled with the sound of fountains and the scent of jasmine, creating an atmosphere of artificial paradise that masked the reality of captivity. The tragedy of Mariamne revealed the depths of Herod's psychological complexity. His love for her was genuine and overwhelming, but it was poisoned by a paranoia that grew more intense with each passing year. He became convinced that she was plotting against him, influenced perhaps by his sister Salome, who saw the Hasmonean princess as a threat to her own position. The evidence for any actual conspiracy was thin to non-existent, but Herod's jealousy had reached the point where even Mariamne's beauty became a source of suspicion. Surely, he reasoned, such perfection must conceal treachery. When he finally ordered Mariamne's execution in 29 BCE, the king's grief was as spectacular as his earlier passion. Court observers reported that he would wander through the palace calling her name, as if expecting her to emerge from behind one of the silk curtains that still carried her perfume. He commissioned statues of her for every room, transforming the living spaces into a shrine to his murdered love. But rather than finding peace in these memorials, Herod seemed to be tormented by them, sometimes speaking to the marble figures as if they were alive, pleading for forgiveness that carved stone could never grant. The aftermath of Mariamne's death marked the beginning of Herod's descent into what can only be described as sexual and emotional madness. His subsequent marriages became increasingly desperate attempts to recapture what he had destroyed, but each new wife only reminded him of what was missing. He began to stage elaborate recreations of his courtship with Mariamne, forcing his later wives to dress in her clothing and reenact scenes from their early romance. These grotesque performances would end with the king weeping openly, while his current wife stood trapped in another woman's silk gown, afraid to move or speak lest she trigger another explosion of royal grief. Herod's architectural projects during this period reflected his tortured psychological state. The expansion of the temple in Jerusalem, begun partly to curry favor with his Jewish subjects, became an obsession that consumed vast resources and countless lives. But the king seemed less interested in the religious significance of his creation than in its potential as a monument to his own suffering. He would visit the construction site at night, walking alone among the massive stones while workers whispered that he was trying to build his way back to some lost happiness. His palace at Herodium, built atop an artificial mountain, constructed entirely for the purpose, represented the pinnacle of his architectural megalomania. This fortress palace was designed not for defense, but for display. Its rooms arranged to create dramatic vistas of the Judean desert that served as backdrops for the king's increasingly elaborate domestic entertainments. Here, surrounded by his remaining wives and concubines, Herod would stage banquets that lasted for days, trying to recreate the happiness of his early years through sheer material excess. But the palace's most disturbing feature was a series of chambers that Herod had designed as exact replicas of Mariamne's apartments, down to the placement of furniture and the patterns of light from carefully positioned windows. He would sometimes disappear into these rooms for days at a time, emerging haggard and disoriented, as if he had been attempting to travel back in time through the careful arrangement of physical objects. His remaining wives learned to avoid these chambers entirely, understanding that their presence would only remind the king of what he had lost. As age began to ravage Herod's body, his appetites took on an increasingly desperate character. He began to collect young women from across his kingdom, not for marriage but simply for the pleasure of surrounding himself with beauty. These women lived in luxury but virtual imprisonment, their lives entirely dependent on the king's changeable moods. Some were elevated to positions of influence, while others simply vanished when they failed to provide whatever comfort the king was seeking. The king's final years were marked by a paranoia so intense that it consumed even his relationships with his own children. Convinced that his sons were plotting against him, he ordered the execution of several of them, including 2 of his children with Mariamne. These murders, committed against his own flesh and blood, seemed to complete the destruction of whatever humanity had once existed within the king's tormented psyche. When death finally came to Herod in 4 BCE, his passing was marked not by grief but by relief among those who had survived his reign. His magnificent palaces, built to house his collection of wives and his memories of lost love, gradually fell into ruin as his kingdom was divided among his surviving sons. The great stones of Masada would eventually witness the suicide of Jewish rebels rather than the romantic obsessions of their builder, while the chambers designed to recapture vanished happiness stood empty, their frescoes fading in the desert's sun. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind moves through the ruins of Herod's palaces, guides sometimes claim they can still hear whispers, echoing through the empty chambers, ghostly conversations between a king and the woman he loved, so intensely that he destroyed her, and in destroying her, destroyed himself. The magnificent buildings remain as monuments to architectural genius, but they carry within their stones a darker legacy. The story of a man who confused possession with love and who learned, too late, that some treasures cannot be held by force. The cruel Prince King, John of England. In the shadows of medieval England, where castle walls rose like stone prayers against a grey sky and the scent of wood smoke drifted across muddy village streets, there once ruled a king whose appetites would become the stuff of legend, but not the kind of legend any ruler would wish to claim. His name was John Lackland, and though history would remember him primarily for signing the Magna Carta, those who lived through his reign knew him by a darker reputation, as a man whose sexual predations and casual cruelties made him perhaps the most reviled monarch ever to wear the English crown. Born the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John had been raised in a court where power was currency and weakness was death. His brothers Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, and Geoffrey of Brittany had inherited their father's political acumen and their mother's fierce intelligence. But John seemed to have inherited only their appetite for dominance, without the wisdom or restraint that might have made him a successful ruler. From his earliest years, he displayed a cunning that was matched only by his complete indifference to the suffering of others. When John finally ascended to the throne in 1199, following Richard's death during the Third Crusade, He inherited an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. But where Richard had been absent pursuing glory in the Holy Land, John was very much present in his domains, a presence that would prove far more troubling to his subjects than any royal absence could have been. The new king approached his realm not as a trust to be preserved, but as a personal treasure house to be plundered for his own pleasure. The pattern of John's predatory behavior emerged almost immediately upon his coronation. Unlike previous kings, who had contented themselves with more conventional forms of royal privilege, John seemed to view every attractive woman in his kingdom as potential prey. His methods were sophisticated and systematic, combining the machinery of royal administration with personal appetites in ways that transformed the very structure of government into an instrument of sexual coercion. The king's marriage to Isabella of Angoulême in 1200 provided the first clear indication of his character. Isabella had been betrothed to Hugh de Lusignan, but John simply appropriated her for himself, using his royal authority to break an existing engagement and claim the 12-year-old girl as his bride. The wedding ceremony itself was conducted with indecent haste, as if the king could barely contain his desire long enough for the proper rituals to be completed. Contemporary chroniclers noted that John seemed more interested in consummating the marriage than in securing the political alliance it was supposed to represent. But Isabella's youth and beauty, rather than satisfying the king's appetites, seemed only to sharpen them. Court observers began to notice a pattern in John's behavior that would define his entire reign: an inability to be satisfied with what he possessed, no matter how magnificent, combined with an compulsive need to take what belonged to others. The young queen became less a wife than a prize to be displayed, while John's attention turned to other targets throughout his realm. The king's system of hospitality levies represented perhaps the most systematic sexual predation in English royal history. Under the guise of asserting feudal rights, John would demand that noble families provide not just military service and financial support, but also personal attendance at court. These demands specifically included the daughters and young wives of his barons, who were required to serve as hostesses during royal visits. What began as a form of taxation quickly evolved into something far more sinister. Contemporary documents, preserved in monastery archives by monks who dared not speak openly but could not bear to remain silent, describe a court where young noble women lived in constant fear of royal attention. The king would move through his realm like a predator, staying at various castles and manors while systematically violating the daughters of his own supporters. Those who resisted might find their families charged with treason. Those who submitted discovered that compliance brought no protection from future demands. The most notorious case involved Matilda de Braose, wife of William de Braose, one of John's most powerful barons. When Matilda refused to allow her son to be taken as a hostage and publicly declared that she would not trust any member of her family to a king who had murdered his own nephew, John's revenge was swift and terrible. The de Braose family was hunted across Ireland and Wales, their properties confiscated, and their supporters terrorized. Matilda and her son were eventually captured and imprisoned in Corfe Castle, where they were left to starve to death, a fate that served as a warning to any other noble family that might consider resisting royal demands. But John's cruelties extended beyond the nobility to encompass victims from every level of society. Village priests reported young women disappearing when the royal household passed through their parishes, while merchant families found their daughters recruited for service in the royal household under circumstances that left little doubt about their true purpose. The king seemed particularly drawn to women who were already married, as if the violation of existing bonds added to his pleasure in ways that simple seduction could not provide. The king's domestic arrangements at his various castles reflected this predatory approach to sexuality. Rather than maintaining a conventional royal household, John created what amounted to a network of private brothels disguised as royal residences. Young women who caught his attention would be installed in comfortable chambers and provided with luxuries that exceeded their former circumstances, but they were also effectively prisoners. their lives entirely dependent on maintaining the king's interest and avoiding his unpredictable rages. Court records from this period, written in the careful Latin that allowed chroniclers to describe unspeakable acts in scholarly language, speak of chamber services that were required from these women. The euphemistic language cannot disguise the reality. John had systematized sexual coercion to a degree that transformed it from personal vice into governmental policy. The machinery of royal administration, sheriffs, bailiffs, and court officials became accomplices in a system that used the threat of imprisonment, taxation, or worse to ensure compliance with royal desires. Perhaps most disturbing was John's apparent enjoyment of the fear he inspired. Unlike other royal libertines who might have attempted discretion, John seemed to take pleasure in the knowledge that his approach was anticipated with terror. He would announce his visits to various castles well in advance, giving families time to contemplate what compliance or resistance might cost them. Some nobles sent their daughters away when they learned of an impending royal visit, but John's administrative network was sophisticated enough to track such movements, and those who attempted to hide their female relatives might find themselves facing charges of defrauding the crown. The king's treatment of clergy who attempted to protest his behavior revealed the extent to which his appetites had corrupted his judgment. When Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, preached sermons that seemed to criticize royal morality, John responded not with theological argument, but with systematic persecution of the church's property and personnel. Monasteries were raided, church lands confiscated, and priests who spoke too boldly about royal virtue found themselves facing exile or worse. As opposition to John's rule began to coalesce around the emerging concept of limiting royal power, the king's sexual predations became one of the central grievances of the rebellious barons. The Magna Carta, signed under duress at Runnymede in 1215, contained several clauses that were clearly designed to address John's systematic abuse of women under his authority. The document's provisions protecting the rights of widows and preventing forced marriages were not abstract legal principles but direct responses to specific royal behaviors that had terrorized England's noble families for over a decade. But even the signing of the Magna Carta did not immediately transform John's character. He continued to view the document as a temporary inconvenience rather than a fundamental limitation on royal power, and his behavior toward women remained largely unchanged. What had changed was the willingness of his subjects to accept such behavior as an inevitable consequence of royal authority. The seeds of constitutional monarchy had been planted in the soil of sexual outrage, growing from the simple recognition that no king, regardless of his divine mandate, should possess absolute power over the bodies and lives of his subjects. When John died in 1216, reportedly from dysentery contracted while campaigning against his rebellious barons, the reaction throughout England was not grief, but relief. His death removed not just a political obstacle but a personal threat that had hung over every family with attractive daughters or young wives. The new king, Henry III, was only 9 years old, but even a child on the throne was preferable to an adult whose appetites had made him the enemy of his own subjects. In the quiet hours before dawn, when mist rises from the meadows at Runnymede and ancient stones whisper with the voices of the dead, historians sometimes pause to contemplate the strange irony of John's legacy. The king, whose appetites had terrorized a kingdom, inadvertently became the catalyst for the constitutional principles that would eventually limit royal power throughout the Western world. His inability to control his own desires had forced his subjects to create mechanisms for controlling royal authority itself, a transformation that would echo through the centuries long after the last memory of his personal cruelties had faded into the darkness of medieval history. A crown of roses, thorns, Edward II. In the mist-shrouded years of the early 14th century, when England stood as one of Europe's great powers and knights, rode forth under banners that bore the proud leopards of Plantagenet, there ascended to the throne a king whose reign would become a cautionary tale about the price of placing personal desire above royal duty. Edward II was tall, handsome, and possessed of considerable athletic ability in different circumstances. He might have been remembered as one of England's great warrior kings. Instead, his name would forever be associated with the scandal of his relationships with male favorites and the ultimate humiliation of becoming the first English king to be formally deposed by his own subjects. Edward's tragedy began not with any inherent weakness of character, but with the impossible burden of following his father, Edward VIII, Hammer of the Scots, a king whose military achievements and forceful personality had made him one of the most respected monarchs in Europe. Where Edward I had been a natural leader who commanded respect through sheer force of will, his son was a more complex and sensitive soul who seemed genuinely puzzled by the aggressive masculinity that medieval kingship demanded. The young prince preferred music to warfare, crafts to statecraft, and above all, the company of beautiful young men to the rough fellowship of knights and barons. The first sign of trouble came with Edward's relationship with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight's son who had been brought to court as a companion for the future king. Contemporary chroniclers struggle to find appropriate language to describe the intensity of their bond, but the implications of their relationship were clear to everyone who witnessed it. Edward showered Gaveston with gifts that would have been appropriate for a queen, jewels, lands, titles, and most controversially, a level of physical intimacy that scandalized even the relatively tolerant court of the early 14th century. When Edward became king in 1307, his first act was to recall Gaveston from exile, where his father had banished the young Gascon to prevent further scandal. The reunion between the two men was conducted with such obvious joy and physical affection that witnesses reported feeling embarrassed to observe it. Edward immediately created Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, a title traditionally reserved for members of the royal family, and began including him in state ceremonies in ways that suggested he was being treated as a royal consort rather than merely a favorite courtier. But it was not simply the existence of Edward's relationship with Gaveston that scandalized England. It was the king's complete inability to maintain even the pretense of discretion. Medieval courts were accustomed to rulers who took male lovers. What they expected was a certain level of political sophistication that would allow the kingdom's business to continue while the king pursued his private pleasures. Edward, however, seemed incapable of separating his personal desires from his royal duties, treating state functions as opportunities to publicly display his affection for Gaveston, while ignoring the increasingly urgent demands of governance. The crisis deepened when Edward married Isabella of France, a marriage arranged to cement the alliance between England and France, but which quickly became a source of further scandal. Isabella was intelligent, beautiful, and possessed of the kind of regal dignity that medieval queens were expected to display. She had every reason to expect that her marriage, while perhaps not passionate, would at least provide her with the respect and ceremonial precedence that was her due as Queen of England. Instead, she found herself systematically humiliated by a husband who seemed to view her as an inconvenient obstacle to his real relationship. At the wedding feast, Edward's attention was focused entirely on Gaveston, who had been given a place of honor that should have belonged to the bride's relatives. The king spent the evening in intimate conversation with his favorite, occasionally remembering to acknowledge his new wife with the kind of distracted courtesy one might show to a distant acquaintance. When the time came for the ceremonial bedding, Edward performed his dynastic duty with such obvious reluctance that courtiers reported feeling pity for the young queen, who maintained her dignity despite the obvious humiliation. The living arrangements that Edward established after his marriage revealed the true nature of his priorities. Rather than maintaining separate royal apartments for himself and his queen, as was traditional, the king insisted that Gaveston be housed in chambers adjacent to his own, connected by a private passage that allowed the favorite to come and go without being observed by the court. Isabella found herself relegated to quarters that, while luxurious, were clearly designed to keep her at a distance from her husband's real life. But it was the king's behavior during state occasions that truly revealed the extent to which his personal relationships had compromised his ability to rule effectively. Foreign ambassadors reported their shock at witnessing a king of England who would interrupt important diplomatic negotiations to engage in whispered conversations with his favorite, or who would allow Gaveston to contradict royal decisions in front of foreign dignitaries. The careful choreography that medieval kingship required the balance of dignity, authority, and accessibility that allowed a monarch to command respect while remaining approachable was completely abandoned in favor of an intimacy that made everyone around them uncomfortable. The English nobility's patience finally snapped when Edward began granting Gaveston authority that effectively made him a co-ruler. The favorite was given control over royal finances, allowed to make appointments to important positions, and even permitted to conduct diplomatic negotiations on behalf of the crown. For proud barons who had served the crown for generations, the spectacle of a foreign upstart wielding power through his access to the king's bedchamber was intolerable. More practically, they recognized that Gaveston's influence was making effective governance impossible. How could they provide counsel to a king who was clearly more interested in his lover's opinions than in their advice? The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. A group of powerful earls, led by Edward's own cousin, Thomas of Lancaster, presented the king with an ultimatum. Either Gaveston would leave England permanently, or they would take matters into their own hands. Edward's response revealed both his genuine love for Gaveston and his complete misunderstanding of the political realities he faced. He agreed to the exile, but immediately began making plans to bring his favorite back as soon as the baron's attention was focused elsewhere. The cycle of exile and return that followed demonstrated Edward's inability to choose between his personal happiness and his royal responsibilities. Each time Gaveston returned to England, his relationship with the king would resume with renewed intensity, as if the separation had only strengthened their bond. But each return also deepened the nobility's anger and convinced them that their king was fundamentally unfit to rule. The final return, in 1312, would prove fatal not just for Gaveston, but for any hope that Edward might learn to separate his private desires from his public duties. When the earls finally captured Gaveston, they showed no mercy to the man who had humiliated them for years. The favorite was executed without trial, his head struck off on a hill overlooking the castle, where he had once lived in luxury as the king's beloved. Edward's grief at the news was so profound that witnesses feared for his sanity, reportedly spent days talking to Gaveston's embalmed body, refusing to allow it to be buried and insisting that his lover was merely sleeping and would soon awaken. But even Gaveston's death could not cure Edward of his need for intimate male companionship. Within a few years, he had become infatuated with Hugh Despenser the Younger, a relationship that would prove even more politically destructive than his affair with Gaveston. Where the Gascon had at least possessed personal charm and a certain roguish appeal, Despenser was universally despised as grasping, cruel, and completely without redeeming qualities. Yet Edward loved him with the same desperate intensity he had shown Gaveston, granting him even greater power and becoming increasingly isolated from all other human relationships. The pattern that had destroyed Gaveston repeated itself with Despenser, but with even more tragic consequences. The king's infatuation with his new favorite made effective governance impossible, while Despenser's abuse of his position created enemies throughout the kingdom. Queen Isabella, who had endured years of humiliation with remarkable dignity, finally reached the breaking point when Despenser began to threaten her own safety and that of her children. Her decision to take a lover of her own, Roger Mortimer, and to use their relationship as the basis for a rebellion against her husband was both personal revenge and political necessity. The invasion that Isabella launched from France in 1326 was welcomed throughout England as a liberation from tyranny. Edward's support collapsed with startling speed, as nobles who had served his family for generations abandoned a king who had proven incapable of putting the kingdom's needs above his own desires. When Edward was finally captured, his fate was sealed not by his enemy's cruelty, but by his own inability to understand that kingship required sacrifices that he had never been willing to make. The deposition ceremony that followed was unprecedented in English history. Never before had a reigning king been formally stripped of his crown by his own subjects. The charges against Edward focused not on his sexual relationships per se, but on his failure to govern effectively because of his obsession with unworthy favorites. The message was clear. A king could love whomever he chose, but only if he could still fulfill his duties to the realm. Edward's death in Berkeley Castle in 1327 remains one of history's most controversial mysteries. The official cause was given as natural illness, but persistent rumors suggested a more horrible fate to death by red-hot poker, inserted in a manner that would leave no external marks while providing a grotesque commentary on the king's sexual preferences. Whether or not these stories were true, they reflected the profound anger that Edward's reign had generated among his subjects, who felt that their king had betrayed not just his political obligations, but the very concept of masculine honor that medieval kingship embodied. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mists rise from the English countryside and ancient castles stand silent against the grey sky, some claim they can still hear the echo of Edward's laments for his lost love, Sir King, who understood passion but never learned wisdom, who chose the warmth of human companionship over the cold demands of royal duty, and who paid the ultimate price for believing that a crown could protect him from the consequences of his own heart's demands. Thunder in the Kremlin. Ivan Eve, the Terrible. In the frozen depths of 16th century Russia, when Moscow stood as the center of a vast empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, and the Orthodox Church proclaimed the Tsars to be God's chosen representatives on earth, there ruled a sovereign whose appetites would become the stuff of nightmare. Ivan the Terrible ascended to the throne as a child of 3, his path to absolute power paved with the blood of boyars who had murdered his mother and terrorized his youth. By the time he reached manhood, this brilliant and unstable prince had transformed the trauma of his early years into a system of government based on terror, paranoia, and sexual violence that would make his name synonymous with tyranny for centuries to come. The transformation of Ivan from promising young ruler to monstrous despot was gradual, marked by moments of genuine achievement that make his later crimes all the more tragic. In his early years, guided by wise counselors and his beloved first wife Anastasia, Ivan had shown signs of becoming one of Russia's greatest rulers. He reformed the legal code, expanded trade with Western Europe, and conquered the Tatar strongholds of Kazan and Astrakhan, victories that freed millions of Orthodox Christians from Muslim rule and earned him genuine popularity among his subjects. But Anastasia's sudden death in 1560, which Ivan became convinced was the result of poisoning by jealous boyars, marked the beginning of his descent into madness. The grief-stricken Tsar began to see enemies everywhere, convinced that the same aristocratic families who had tormented his childhood were now systematically destroying everything he loved. His response was the creation of the Oprichnina, a state within a state that gave him absolute power over roughly half of Russia and provided the institutional framework for atrocities that would surpass anything Europe had seen since the days of Caligula. The Oprichniki, Ivan's black-clad enforcers, were more than mere secret police. They were the instruments of a ruler who had confused his own psychological torment with divine mandate. Dressed in monkish robes and riding black horses, they swept across the Russian countryside like a plague, empowered to arrest, torture, and execute anyone whom the Tsar suspected of disloyalty. But it was not merely political opposition that Ivan sought to crush. It was the very concept of resistance to his will, whether that resistance came from stubborn boyars, independent-minded merchants, or simply women who failed to show sufficient enthusiasm for his attentions. The center of Ivan's reign of terror was the Alexandrova Sloboda, a fortified compound north of Moscow that served as both military headquarters and pleasure palace. Here, surrounded by his most loyal oprichniki, the Tsar created a grotesque parody of monastic life, with himself as abbot of an order devoted not to prayer and contemplation, but to violence and sexual excess. The compound's buildings were arranged around a central cathedral where Ivan would conduct religious services that combined Orthodox ritual with pagan elements drawn from Russia's pre-Christian past, ceremonies that often concluded with orgies that lasted for days. Ivan's personal apartments within the Sloboda revealed the extent to which his religious mania had merged with his sexual appetites. The walls were covered with icons painted to resemble his various wives and mistresses, as if he was creating a personal pantheon of female saints, whose primary qualification for veneration was their willingness to submit to his desires. The Tsar would pray before these blasphemous images while naked, his body scarred by the self-flagellation that had become a regular part of his spiritual practices, before summoning whichever woman had currently captured his fancy for what he called sacred union. But it was Ivan's treatment of the families of suspected traitors that revealed the true depths of his depravity. The Tsar had developed a system of collective punishment that held entire bloodlines responsible for the perceived crimes of individual members, but his interpretation of punishment went far beyond mere execution. When he ordered the destruction of a boyar family, Ivan insisted on personally participating in the violation of the women before their eventual deaths, arguing that this was necessary to ensure that no treacherous bloodline could continue to threaten his rule. These family destructions became elaborate rituals that combined elements of religious ceremony, theatrical performance, and sexual violence in ways that defied all previous understanding of royal behavior. Ivan would appear before his victims dressed in the robes of an Orthodox priest, conducting a mock funeral service for the family while they were still alive, before stripping off his vestments to reveal the naked body of a man who had long since ceased to distinguish between divine authority and personal gratification. The oprichniki would join in these ceremonies, their participation both enforcing the Tsar's will and implicating them in crimes that ensured their continued loyalty through shared guilt. The most notorious of these family exterminations was the destruction of the Staritsky clan, relatives of Ivan's who had maintained a legitimate claim to the throne. When the Tsar became convinced that Vladimir Staritsky was plotting against him, he ordered not just the prince's death, but the elimination of his entire extended family, including children who could not have posed any realistic threat to imperial authority. The process took 3 days to complete, with Ivan personally participating in the rape and murder of every female member of the family, while forcing the male relatives to watch before they too were killed. But perhaps most disturbing was Ivan's relationship with his own family, particularly his daughters-in-law, whom he treated as personal property available for his use whenever his appetites demanded satisfaction. When his son Ivan Ivanovich married Elena Sheremeteva, the Tsar established a custom of blessing the union by claiming the right of first intercourse with the bride, a violation of every tradition of Orthodox marriage that he justified as an expression of paternal authority. The young woman's pregnancy following this assault led to a confrontation with his son that would have tragic consequences for the entire dynasty. The incident that would define Ivan's legacy occurred during one of these family disputes, when the Tsarevich attempted to protect his pregnant wife from his father's unwanted attentions. Ivan's response was swift and brutally struck his son in the head with his iron staff, inflicting a wound that would prove fatal within days. The sight of his heir dying from injuries he had inflicted sent Ivan into a state of grief and madness that his courtiers described as resembling demonic possession, with the Tsar alternately raging against his boyars for failing to prevent the tragedy and begging his dying son for forgiveness that would never come. The aftermath of Ivan Ivanovich's death marked the beginning of the end for Ivan's reign of terror. The Tsar's remaining son, Fyodor, was mentally disabled and clearly unfit to rule, meaning that the dynasty would likely die with Ivan himself. This prospect seemed to intensify rather than moderate the Tsar's cruelty, as if he was determined to inflict as much suffering as possible before his own inevitable death ended his capacity for violence. The final years of Ivan's reign were marked by increasingly elaborate attempts to find spiritual purification for the crimes he had committed. The Tsar would spend hours in prayer and self-flagellation, his body covered with wounds that never seemed to heal properly, while simultaneously planning new atrocities against anyone he suspected of disloyalty. He began construction of a massive cathedral within the Kremlin, dedicated to his deceased son, but filled it with torture devices that he claimed were necessary for the proper preparation of souls before they could enter heaven. Ivan's sexual appetites remained undiminished, even as his body began to fail. In his final years, he took an eighth wife, Maria Nagaya Despite, orthodox law that forbade more than 3 marriages, justifying this latest violation of religious law by claiming that God had spoken to him personally and granted special dispensation. The wedding ceremony was a grotesque spectacle that combined traditional Russian customs with innovations that reflected the Tsar's deteriorating mental state, including the ritual sacrifice of prisoners whose blood was used to bless the marriage bed. The end came in 1584, when Ivan collapsed while playing chess with one of his boyars, his body finally succumbing to a combination of mercury poisoning from his syphilis treatments and the cumulative effects of decades of self-abuse. His death was greeted with relief throughout Russia, but the damage he had inflicted on the country would take generations to repair. The institution of autocracy that he had perfected would survive him, but it would forever be associated with the capacity for absolute power to corrupt absolutely, transforming even legitimate authority into an instrument of personal gratification and collective suffering. In the quiet hours before dawn, when snow falls silently on the ancient walls of the Kremlin and Orthodox bells toll across the sleeping city, some claim they can still hear the echo of Ivan's prayers and curses the voice of a man who confused divine mandate with personal desire, who sought God's blessing for the very acts that damned his soul, and who left behind a legacy that would haunt Russian autocracy until the very foundations of Tsarist power crumbled beneath the weight of their own contradictions. Banquets of Blood, VLAD II, Dracula. In the mist-shrouded mountains of 15th century Wallachia, where ancient forests whispered with the ghosts of forgotten gods and wolves howled beneath cold stars, there ruled a prince whose name would become synonymous with darkness itself, VLAD III. Known to his enemies as Vlad the Impaler, and to history as Dracula was born into a world where survival required cruelty, and where the line between justice and atrocity had been blurred by centuries of Ottoman invasion and internal strife. Yet even in an age accustomed to brutality, this brilliant and tormented prince would create forms of violence so elaborate and theatrical that they would transcend mere warfare to become something approaching dark art. Vlad's path to infamy had been shaped by the traumatic experiences of his youth, when he and his younger brother Radu had been given as hostages to the Ottoman Sultan as guarantees of their father's loyalty. The years spent in Turkish captivity had exposed the young prince to levels of sophisticated cruelty that European courts could barely imagine, while simultaneously instilling in him a burning hatred for the Muslim rulers who had destroyed so many Christian communities throughout the Balkans. When he finally returned to claim his throne in Wallachia, Vlad brought with him knowledge of Ottoman methods combined with a creative intelligence that would transform routine execution into elaborate spectacle. The infamous forest of stakes that gave Vlad his nickname was more than mere execution. Grounded was a carefully designed theater where death became performance art. The prince had studied the Ottoman practice of impalement and refined it into something that served multiple purposes: punishment for his enemies, entertainment for his court, and psychological warfare against anyone who might consider opposing his rule. But where Turkish executioners typically used impalement as a relatively quick method of execution, Vlad developed techniques that could keep victims alive for hours or even days, their dying screams providing a soundtrack for his elaborate dinner parties. The most notorious of these entertainments occurred in 1459, when Vlad invited the boyars of Targovishte to what he called a feast of reconciliation, ostensibly designed to heal the wounds left by years of civil war. The noble families arrived in their finest clothing, expecting a traditional banquet that would mark the beginning of a new era of cooperation between the prince and his aristocracy. Instead, they found themselves guests at an execution that would last for 3 days and nights, with Vlad personally supervising the impalement of hundreds of men, women, and children, while their relatives were forced to watch from tables arranged in a circle around the killing ground. But it was not merely the scale of these executions that set Vlad apart from other cruel rulers. It was the artistic attention he paid to every detail of the process. The prince had commissioned the construction of stakes of varying heights and thicknesses, each designed to produce different sounds as they penetrated human flesh. He arranged his victims according to aesthetic principles that reflected his understanding of visual composition, creating human sculptures that would change and evolve as the bodies slowly sank lower on their wooden spikes. The dyeing process became a form of living art, with Vlad as both artist and sole audience for performances that could never be repeated. The dining arrangements for these occasions revealed the prince's sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation, rather than simply watching the executions from a distance. Vlad insisted that his guests continue their meals, while seated close enough to hear the victim's final words and smell the scent of blood and evacuated bowels that hung over the killing field. The contrast between the luxury of the feast-fine wines, roasted meats, silk tablecloth sand, the horror taking place mere yards away, was carefully calculated to break down his guests' psychological defenses and remind them that their own survival depended entirely on his continued favor. Vlad's sexual appetites were inextricably connected to his taste for violence, as if he could only achieve satisfaction when his pleasure was seasoned with others' pain. The prince maintained a household of concubines drawn from the wives and daughters of executed enemies, women who were forced to choose between death and sexual slavery in the court of the man who had destroyed their families. These unfortunate souls lived in constant terror, knowing that any sign of reluctance or displeasure might mark them for inclusion in the next day's entertainment. The prince's bedchamber had been arranged to provide a view of the courtyard where executions took place, allowing him to combine sexual activity with the observation of death in ways that his contemporaries found incomprehensible. Foreign ambassadors who were granted audiences in these private chambers reported their shock at finding themselves discussing matters of state while impaled victims writhed in agony outside the windows, their prince apparently aroused rather than disturbed by the proximity of suffering and pleasure. But perhaps most disturbing was Vlad's treatment of captured Ottoman soldiers, whom he saw not merely as military enemies, but as personal representatives of the power that had humiliated him in his youth. When he captured Turkish raiding parties, the prince would stage elaborate ceremonies that combined elements of Christian ritual with pagan sacrifice, claiming that he was offering the souls of his enemies to God as payment for the liberation of Wallachia. These theological justifications for torture revealed the profound psychological damage that his captivity had inflicted, as if he was simultaneously seeking divine approval for his actions and personal revenge against every Muslim who reminded him of his own powerlessness as a child. The most infamous of these anti-Ottoman spectacles occurred in 1462, when Vlad captured a force of several thousand Turkish soldiers and spent weeks devising increasingly elaborate methods of execution for each group. The prince arranged the killings according to the prisoners' military ranks, with common soldiers receiving relatively quick deaths while officers were subjected to tortures that lasted for days. The centerpiece of this extended execution was the impalement of the Turkish commander, whom Vlad had slowly lowered onto a specially constructed stake while a choir of Orthodox priests sang hymns of thanksgiving for his victory over the infidel. Vlad's relationship with the Orthodox Church revealed the complex ways in which religious faith could be corrupted by personal trauma and political necessity. The prince was genuinely devout, spending hours in prayer and commissioning the construction of monasteries that would serve as spiritual centers for his kingdom. Yet he seemed incapable of distinguishing between legitimate religious warfare and personal revenge, treating every act of cruelty as a form of divine service that would earn him spiritual merit rather than damnation. The theological implications of Vlad's behavior troubled even the most conservative Orthodox clergy, who struggled to reconcile their prince's obvious piety with his equally obvious sadism. Some priests attempted to counsel him that true Christian warfare required mercy toward defeated enemies, but Vlad's response was typically theatrically, would invite these critics to witness his next execution, arguing that they would understand the necessity of extreme measures once they saw how his enemies deserved to die. The international reaction to Vlad's methods revealed the extent to which his reputation had spread beyond the borders of Wallachia. German merchants who had witnessed his executions returned home with stories that seemed too horrible to believe, while Hungarian diplomats reported their difficulty in conducting normal negotiations with a prince who might interrupt diplomatic discussions to observe the impalement of prisoners in his courtyard. Even the Ottoman Sultan, who was hardly squeamish about violence, referred to Vlad as a man who has forgotten that he is human, suggesting that the prince's cruelty had exceeded even Turkish standards for acceptable brutality. The end came in 1476, when Vlad was killed in battle against a combined force of Ottoman and Wallachian rebels who had finally had enough of their prince's reign of terror. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear. Some accounts suggest he was overwhelmed by enemy soldiers, while others claim he was assassinated by his own men who could no longer tolerate his leadership. What is certain is that his head was cut off and sent to the Ottoman Sultan as proof that the infamous impaler had finally met his match. The legacy that Vlad left behind was complex and contradictory, reflecting the impossible circumstances that had shaped his character and methods. To his surviving subjects, he was remembered as a defender of orthodoxy who had kept the Ottoman Empire at bay during some of its most aggressive expansion. To his enemies, he was a monster whose cruelties had exceeded anything seen since the days of Attila the Hun. To later generations, he became something even more disturbing, a figure whose historical reality was so extreme that it spawned legends that transformed him into a supernatural creature whose appetite for blood could never be satisfied. In the quiet hours before dawn, when mist rises from the Carpathian valleys and ancient castles stand silhouetted against the grey sky, locals still claim they can hear the echo of dying screams carried on the wind-ghostly reminders of a prince who confused personal trauma with divine mission, who sought healing for his own wounds by inflicting greater wounds on others, and who left behind a name that would forever be associated with the darkest possibilities of human nature. 6 wives, 1,000 gossips, Henry VIII. In the golden twilight of medieval England, when the Tudor rose bloomed red and white across a kingdom, finally at peace after decades of civil war, there came to the throne a king whose appetites would reshape not only his own realm, but the very foundations of European Christianity. Henry VIII began his reign as the embodiment of Renaissance kingship, young, handsome, athletic, and brilliant, blessed with the kind of charismatic presence that made courtiers compete for his attention and foreign ambassadors struggle to maintain their diplomatic composure in his presence. Yet, this same man would become history's most notorious royal husband, leaving behind a trail of broken marriages, severed heads, and religious upheaval that would echo through the centuries. The transformation of Henry from the idealistic young prince, who had written treatises defending papal authority, to the bloated tyrant who would break with Rome rather than accept limits on his marital choices, was not immediate. It unfolded. Over decades, like a slow-burning fever, that gradually consumed everything it touched. In his early years, married to Catherine of Aragon, and guided by wise counsellors like Thomas More and Cardinal Wolsey, Henry had seemed destined to become one of England's greatest kings. He was a scholar who could debate theology with university professors, a musician who composed songs that courtiers still sang generations later, and an athlete whose prowess at tennis, hunting, and the tournament field earned him admiration throughout Europe. But beneath this golden exterior lay appetites that would prove impossible to satisfy through conventional means. Henry's sexuality was complex and demanding, requiring not just physical gratification but a level of emotional and intellectual engagement that few women of his era were educated or empowered to provide. The king needed to feel that he was not merely taking what he desired but winning it through his own irresistible charm, a psychological requirement that would lead him to pursue women who were intelligent enough to challenge him and strong-willed enough to resist his initial advances. His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon had begun with genuine affection and mutual respect, but it gradually became a source of frustration as the Queen failed to provide the male heir that Henry believed was essential for the stability of his dynasty. The king's growing obsession with his wife's apparent barrenness was complicated by his awareness of her strong personality and political connections. Catherine was not merely a woman who had disappointed him, but a representative of Spanish power, whose continued presence in England affected the balance of European politics. The crisis deepened when Henry became infatuated with Anne Boleyn, a young woman whose intelligence and sophistication had been honed by years at the French court. Unlike the compliant court ladies who typically caught royal attention, Anne possessed both the wit to engage Henry in intellectual sparring and the political awareness to understand that her best chance of security lay not in becoming the king's mistress, but in somehow replacing his wife entirely. The dance of seduction that followed would last for 6 years and would ultimately tear apart the medieval unity of Western Christianity. Anne's strategy of resistance was perfectly calculated to inflame Henry's competitive instincts while simultaneously appealing to his genuine intellectual curiosity. She introduced him to religious texts that questioned papal authority, engaged him in theological debates that challenged his previous assumptions about church governance, and most importantly, withheld physical intimacy while providing enough encouragement to keep him pursuing her with increasing desperation. The king found himself in the unprecedented position of being forced to court a woman rather than simply commanding her presence, a reversal of normal power dynamics that both frustrated and excited him. The great matter, as Henry's pursuit of an annulment came to be known, revealed the extent to which the king was willing to reshape reality rather than accept limitations on his desires. When Pope Clement VII refused to declare his marriage to Catherine invalid, Henry's response was not compromise, but revolution. He would break with Rome, declare himself supreme head of the Church of England, and create an entirely new religious establishment that would validate his marital choices. The scope of this transformation was staggering. In order to marry the woman he desired, Henry was prepared to isolate England from Catholic Europe, confiscate the vast wealth of the monasteries, and execute anyone who refused to acknowledge his new authority. But even as Henry achieved his immediate goal of marrying Anne Boleyn, the psychological patterns that had driven his pursuit of her continued to operate in ways that would ultimately destroy their relationship. The king's need for constant validation required not merely a wife, but an audience of admirers whose attention confirmed his irresistible appeal. Anne, now secure in her position as queen, began to display the kind of independent spirit that had originally attracted Henry, but which he found intolerable in a wife who was supposed to be grateful for his favor. The court that Henry created around his new marriage was designed to showcase his virility and charisma while providing him with endless opportunities for flirtation and conquest. The elaborate masques and tournaments that marked major celebrations became hunting grounds where the king could pursue the wives and daughters of his courtiers, while their husbands pretended not to notice the royal attention. Their women, were receiving. These public displays of Henry's sexuality served multiple purposes. They reinforced his image as an irresistible monarch, provided him with a constant supply of new romantic challenges, and reminded everyone at court that their king's appetites were both insatiable and unpredictable. But it was the speed with which Henry's affections could turn to murderous hatred that truly revealed the darkness underlying his charm. When Anne failed to produce the male heir he had risked everything to obtain, the king's disappointment quickly transformed into the kind of paranoid rage that had marked his father's final years. The same intelligence and spirit that had originally captivated him became evidence of treachery, while her inability to give him a son was reinterpreted as deliberate defiance of his will. The destruction of Anne Boleyn was orchestrated with the same attention to detail that Henry had once devoted to winning her. The king assembled a case for adultery and treason that was legally flimsy but politically devastating, using the very courtiers who had once competed for her attention as witnesses against her supposed infidelities. The trial that followed was a foregone conclusion, but Henry insisted on maintaining the fiction that justice was being served rather than royal convenience, as if he needed to convince himself that his actions were motivated by principle rather than mere expedience. Anne's execution in 1536 marked a turning point in Henry's relationship with his own nobility, demonstrating that not even queens were safe from his wrath if they failed to meet his expectations. The message was clear. The king's favor was conditional on continued satisfaction of his needs, and those needs were subject to change without warning. The effect on court culture was immediate and profound where, once courtiers had competed to attract royal attention, they now understood that such attention could be as dangerous as it was rewarding. The pattern established with Anne Boleyn would repeat itself throughout Henry's remaining marriages, each relationship following a similar trajectory from pursuit to satisfaction to disappointment to destruction. Jane Seymour's death in childbirth prevented her from experiencing the king's eventual disillusionment, while Anne of Cleves' political value protected her from anything worse than humiliating divorce. But Catherine Howard's youth and alleged promiscuity would cost her head, while Catherine Parr survived only by carefully managing her husband's moods and maintaining the submissive demeanor that he had come to expect from his wives. The court that surrounded Henry's later marriages was a very different place from the glittering Renaissance palace of his youth, where once the greatest danger had been failing to catch the king's attention. Courtiers now understood that royal favor could be more dangerous than royal displeasure. The elaborate ceremonies and entertainments that had once celebrated royal weddings became exercises in careful choreography, designed to provide Henry with the validation he craved, while ensuring that no one else attracted too much attention. The king's physical deterioration in his later years was matched by an increasing paranoia that transformed every aspect of court life into a potential source of threat. Henry's massive bulk, the result of decades of indulgence and a leg wound that never properly healed, made him dependent on others for basic mobility, while simultaneously increasing his suspicion that those around him were plotting to take advantage of his weakness. The same charm that had once made him irresistible became a weapon that he wielded unpredictably, capable of destroying careers and lives with a casual word or gesture. The financial cost of Henry's marital adventures was staggering, not merely in terms of the legal proceedings and ceremonial expenses, but in the broader economic impact of his religious revolution. The dissolution of the monasteries, which Henry had originally justified as necessary for church reform, became primarily a means of funding his increasingly expensive lifestyle and his endless quest for the perfect wife. Ancient institutions that had provided education, healthcare, and charity for centuries were stripped of their wealth to pay for royal weddings, elaborate court entertainments, and the military campaigns that Henry launched to distract attention from his domestic failures. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Henry's reign was the way his personal obsessions distorted England's development as a nation. The king, who had once shown genuine promise as a scholar and reformer, became so consumed with his own desires that he lost sight of the broader responsibilities of kingship. Foreign policy became subordinated to marital policy, with England's alliances shifting according to which European power might be useful in validating Henry's latest matrimonial choice. Domestic governance suffered as the king's attention focused on the minutiae of courtship and wedding planning, while pressing issues of law, taxation, and social reform were neglected or handled by ministers who understood that their survival depended on not upstaging their master's romantic interests. The psychological impact of Henry's reign on English society was equally profound. A generation of nobles grew up understanding that marriage itself could be a form of treason if it displeased the king, while young women learned that royal attention was something to be feared rather than desired. The traditional bonds of family loyalty and marital fidelity that had held aristocratic society together were weakened by the constant example of a king who treated wives as disposable commodities and who demanded that his subjects prioritize royal convenience over their own moral convictions. Henry's final years were marked by a loneliness that no amount of power or wealth could assuage. Surrounded by courtiers who told him what they thought he wanted to hear, married to a woman who was careful never to challenge him, and ruling a kingdom that had been reshaped to accommodate his whims, the king found himself isolated in a world of his own creation. The vibrant, charismatic prince, who had once dazzled Europe with his energy and intelligence, had become a suspicious invalid whose primary entertainment came from reviewing the charges against his latest batch of condemned subjects. The end came in January 1547, when Henry's body finally succumbed to the accumulated effects of decades of excess. His death was greeted with relief by many of his subjects, who had grown weary of the constant uncertainty that marked life under a ruler whose moods could determine matters of life and death. The elaborate funeral that followed was designed to celebrate the achievements of his reign, but even his most loyal supporters struggled to identify lasting accomplishments that justified the human cost of his rule. Henry's legacy was complex and contradictory, reflecting the impossible task of reconciling his genuine abilities with the destructive consequences of his appetites. He had created the Church of England, established England as a major naval power, and patronized some of the finest artists and scholars of his age. But he had also executed 2 wives, countless courtiers, and thousands of religious dissidents, while leaving behind a kingdom that was financially exhausted and religiously divided. The 6 wives who had shared his bed and borne the weight of his expectations were remembered with varying degrees of sympathy by later generations. Catherine of Aragon became a symbol of dignified resistance to tyranny. Anne Boleyn, a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition. Jane Seymour, a tragic victim of childbirth. Anne of Cleves, a survivor who had learned to navigate royal favor. Catherine Howard, a foolish girl who had paid the ultimate price for her mistakes. And Catherine Parr, a wise woman who had managed to outlive her dangerous husband. But perhaps the most lasting impact of Henry's reign was the way it changed English attitudes toward royal authority itself. The king, who had claimed divine sanction for his marital choices, had demonstrated that even sacred institutions could be subordinated to personal desire when wielded by someone with sufficient power and determination. Future English monarchs would find themselves constrained by the memory of what absolute royal authority could become when it was exercised by someone who confused his own appetites with the will of God. In the quiet hours before dawn, when mist rises from the Thames and ancient palaces stand silent along its banks, some claim they can still hear the echo of Henry's footsteps in the corridors. He once dominated the ghost of a king who had everything except the wisdom to understand that some hungers can never be satisfied, no matter how many lives are sacrificed in the attempt to feed them. His story remains a reminder that charm and intelligence, when untempered by restraint and compassion, can become more dangerous than the crudest tyranny, and that the pursuit of personal happiness, when elevated above all other considerations, can destroy not only the pursuer, but everyone unfortunate enough to be caught in the path of his desires. The Velvet Mignons, Henry III of France. in the perfumed halls of 16th century France, when the Renaissance had reached its most decadent flowering and the Valois court stood as the envy of Europe for its sophistication and splendor, there ruled a king whose reign would become a scandal that echoed through the centuries. Henry III of France was the last of his ancient line, a man of genuine intelligence and considerable political skill, who might have been remembered as one of his country's great monarchs. Instead, his name would forever be associated with the beautiful young men he called his mignons, favorites, whose influence over royal policy and whose intimate relationship with their king would ultimately cost both them and their master their lives. Henry's path to the throne had been marked by early promise and genuine achievement. As Duke of Anjou, he had proven himself a capable military commander, leading Catholic forces to victory against the Huguenots, while demonstrating the kind of strategic brilliance that suggested he might restore France to the position of European dominance it had enjoyed under his grandfather Francis I. His brief reign as King of Poland had shown that he could govern effectively when circumstances demanded, and his return to France in 1574 to claim his inheritance had been greeted with genuine enthusiasm by a people weary of civil war and religious conflict. But the court that Henry created around himself in Paris was unlike anything France had ever seen, a glittering showcase of aesthetic refinement that pushed the boundaries of Renaissance sensibility into territories that even sophisticated courtiers found difficult to navigate. The king surrounded himself with young men of extraordinary beauty and cultivation, favorites who were chosen not merely for their political usefulness or military prowess, but for their ability to embody an ideal of masculine grace that Henry found irresistible. These mignons, as they came to be known, were more than mere companions. They were living works of art, whose presence transformed the royal court into something approaching a religious cult devoted to the worship of beauty itself. The most famous of these favorites was Anne de Joyeuse, a young nobleman whose angelic features and refined manner captivated not only the king but much of the court. Contemporary accounts describe Joyeuse as possessing an almost feminine delicacy combined with undeniable masculine charm, a combination that Henry found so compelling that he elevated the young man to positions of power that traditional nobles found scandalous. When the king arranged Joyeuse's marriage to his own sister-in-law and provided a dowry that exceeded what most princes could expect, it became clear that this was more than mere royal favorite, was the kind of passionate attachment that medieval society had only seen between kings and their queens. But it was not simply the existence of Henry's relationships with his mignons that scandalized France. It was the public nature of these attachments and the way they seemed to influence every aspect of royal policy. The king would appear at state functions with his favorites, arranged around him like a living constellation of masculine beauty, their clothing coordinated to complement his own outfit, and their movements choreographed to enhance his presence. Foreign ambassadors reported their amazement at witnessing a king of France who seemed more interested in the aesthetic arrangement of his male companions than in the substance of diplomatic negotiations. The elaborate ceremonies that marked the elevation of new mignons to positions of influence became spectacles that combined elements of religious ritual, theatrical performance, and erotic display in ways that challenged traditional French concepts of royal dignity. Henry would personally oversee the preparation of his favorites for public appearances, selecting their clothing, arranging their hair, and even applying cosmetics to enhance their natural beauty. These sessions, conducted in the king's private chambers before audiences of carefully selected courtiers, had an intimate quality that made observers uncomfortable while simultaneously fascinating them with their obvious sincerity. The mignons themselves were required to participate in court ceremonies that pushed the boundaries of acceptable masculine behavior. They would appear at royal banquets, dressed in clothing that incorporated feminine element silk stockings, jeweled earrings, elaborate coiffures that required hours to arrange properly. During formal presentations, they would perform dances that had been choreographed to showcase their grace, while allowing the king to demonstrate his aesthetic sophistication by directing their movements. These performances were defended by royal apologists as expressions of Renaissance ideals of beauty, but they were widely interpreted as evidence of moral corruption that threatened the very foundations of French society. The political implications of Henry's relationships with his mignons became apparent as these beautiful young men began to accumulate real power within the royal administration. The king granted them titles, lands, and offices that traditional nobles believed should have been distributed according to merit or family connections, rather than physical attractiveness. When military commands were given to men whose primary qualification was their ability to please the king in private, the effectiveness of France's armed forces began to suffer in ways that had serious implications for national security. But perhaps most disturbing to contemporary observers was the way Henry's infatuation with his favorites seemed to affect his relationship with his wife, Louise de Lorraine. The Queen, by all accounts a woman of intelligence and dignity, found herself relegated to a ceremonial role, while her husband lavished attention on young men who seemed to occupy the emotional space that should have belonged to her. The royal marriage, which had begun with genuine affection, became a public demonstration of the king's priorities, with Louise forced to smile graciously while her husband openly displayed his preference for masculine companionship. The religious implications of Henry's behavior added another layer of scandal to an already controversial situation. The Catholic Church taught that marriage was a sacred sacrament and that a king's primary duty was to provide an heir for his dynasty, but Henry seemed more interested in the aesthetic pleasure he derived from his mignons than in fulfilling his dynastic obligations. When bishops attempted to counsel him about the importance of royal fertility, the king would respond with theological arguments that sophisticated courtiers found intellectually impressive, but that ordinary French citizens interpreted as blasphemous rationalization. The most shocking aspect of Henry's court was the way it seemed to operate according to principles drawn from classical antiquity rather than Christian morality. The king would quote Greek philosophers who had celebrated masculine love, commission artwork that depicted mythological scenes of gods and mortal men in intimate embraces, and organize entertainments that recreated scenarios from ancient literature where beauty and wisdom were embodied in young male figures. These cultural references were lost on most of his subjects, who saw only a king who seemed to prefer the company of pretty boys to the serious business of governing a major European power. The crisis deepened when Henry's enemies began to use his relationships with the mignons as weapons in their campaign to discredit royal authority. Pamphlets appeared on Paris streets depicting the king in compromising positions with his favorites, while satirical songs mocked his supposed effeminacy and questioned his ability to father the heir that France desperately needed. The Catholic League, already suspicious of Henry's tolerance for Protestant subjects, found in his personal relationships additional evidence that he was unfit to rule a Christian kingdom. The violence that eventually destroyed Henry's court began with attacks on the mignons themselves, as if his enemies understood that the king could be hurt more effectively through his favorites than through direct assault on his person. When Quelus and Maugiron, two of Henry's most beloved companions, were killed in a duel that had clearly been arranged by the king's political opponents, Henry's grief was so profound that witnesses feared for his sanity. The king spent days in his private chambers, refusing to eat or see anyone while he mourned the loss of young men who had represented his ideal of perfect beauty. But even this tragedy could not cure Henry of his need for beautiful masculine companionship. Within months of the deaths of his favorites, the king had surrounded himself with new mignons whose youth and attractiveness seemed designed to replace what he had lost. This pattern of attachment, loss, and replacement convinced his enemies that his behavior was not merely a political weakness, but a psychological compulsion that made him fundamentally unsuitable for royal responsibility. The end came in 1589, when a fanatical monk named Jacques Clément gained access to the royal presence by claiming he had important intelligence about Protestant conspiracies. The assassin's knife found its mark while Henry was surrounded by his current collection of favorites, men whose beauty had once again failed to protect either themselves or their king from the violence of those who found their very existence offensive. The king's final words, according to witnesses, were not prayers for his soul or concerns for his kingdom, but laments for the young men whose lives would be endangered by his death. Henry's murder marked the end of the Valois dynasty and the beginning of a new era in French history, but it also represented the triumph of conventional morality over aesthetic sophistication. The court culture that he had created, with its emphasis on beauty, refinement, and the celebration of masculine grace, died with him, replaced by the more austere and traditionally masculine atmosphere that his successor Henry IV would establish. The Mignons who survived their king's assassination found themselves suddenly without protection in a world that had always viewed them with suspicion and hostility. The legacy of Henry III's reign was complex and contradictory, reflecting the difficulty of reconciling genuine political ability with personal choices that his society found incomprehensible. He had been a patron of the arts, whose court had produced some of the finest poetry and music of the Renaissance. A religious leader who had attempted to heal the wounds left by decades of sectarian warfare, and a king who had tried to govern according to principles of tolerance and aesthetic sophistication that were centuries ahead of his time. But he had also been a man whose personal relationships had made effective governance impossible, and whose inability to produce an heir had left his kingdom vulnerable to the chaos that would follow his death. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the Seine flows silently past the ancient palaces of Paris and the ghosts of dead kings walk through empty halls, some claim they can still hear the echo of laughter and music from Henry's court, the sound of beautiful young men whose grace had once been the center of a king's world, whose influence had shaped the policies of a great nation, and whose memory would forever be associated with the dangerous intersection between political power and personal desire that had ultimately destroyed them all. Merry Monarch's Midnight, Charles II. In the smoky taverns and gilded salons of Restoration London, when England emerged from the grey puritanism of Cromwell's Commonwealth, like a butterfly shaking off its cocoon, there ruled a king whose appetites would become legendary even in an age that celebrated excess. Charles VIII. Merry Monarch had returned from exile in 1660, with a sophisticated understanding of pleasure that had been refined by years of wandering through the most decadent courts of Europe. For 25 years, this dark-eyed Stuart would transform England from a nation of prayer meetings and plain dress into a playground where wit and sensuality reigned supreme, where beautiful women could rise from obscurity to influence the fate of nations, and where the king's bedchamber became as important a center of power as Parliament itself. Charles's transformation from exiled prince to celebrated lover had been forged in the fires of adversity and defeat. After his father's execution in 1649, the young king had spent 11 years wandering through Europe, dependent on the charity of foreign rulers and the loyalty of supporters who risked everything to keep the Stuart cause alive. These years of uncertainty had taught him that survival often required charm, that a penniless king could maintain his dignity only through the force of his personality, and that the careful cultivation of relationships, particularly with women who had access to power, could mean the difference between restoration and permanent exile. The court that Charles created upon his return to England was designed to celebrate life in all its sensual complexity, a deliberate rejection of the austere morality that had characterized the previous decade. Where Cromwell's regime had banned theatre, dancing, and most forms of public entertainment, Charles actively encouraged artistic expression that pushed the boundaries of what English society had previously considered acceptable. The theatres that reopened under royal patronage featured actresses for the first time in English history, women whose beauty and talent made them objects of desire for noblemen and commoners alike, and whose presence on stage symbolized the new freedom that characterized the Restoration era. But it was in his private relationships that Charles most clearly demonstrated his rejection of Puritan values. The king maintained what amounted to a royal harem, a constantly shifting collection of mistresses who ranged from aristocratic ladies seeking political influence to clever commoners whose wit and beauty had caught the royal eye. These relationships were conducted with a refreshing honesty that contrasted sharply with the hypocrisy that had marked much of the previous regime. Charles made no attempt to hide his affairs or justify them in moral terms, treating sexual pleasure as a natural and healthy aspect of royal life. The most famous of these relationships was his long liaison with Barbara Palmer, later Countess of Castlemaine, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her fierce intelligence and ruthless ambition. Barbara had understood from their first meeting that Charles needed more than mere physical satisfaction. He craved intellectual stimulation, emotional support, and the kind of passionate engagement that could make him forget the responsibilities and disappointments that came with wearing a crown. Their relationship, which lasted for over a decade, became a template for royal mistresshood that influenced the expectations and behavior of every woman who sought to capture the king's attention. Barbara's apartments at Whitehall Palace became a center of power that rivaled the official court in its influence over royal policy. Foreign ambassadors learned that access to the king often required first gaining the approval of his current favorite, while English nobles discovered that their wives' and daughters' attractiveness could be as valuable as their own military or political skills in securing royal favor. The king would spend hours in Barbara's chambers, discussing everything from foreign policy to artistic patronage, while enjoying pleasures that his public role prevented him from acknowledging openly. But Charles's approach to royal sexuality was more sophisticated than mere promiscuity. The king had developed an aesthetic of desire that treated his relationships as works of art, each one carefully crafted to provide different forms of satisfaction and stimulation. Where Barbara Palmer offered fierce passion and political acuity, Nell Gwyn provided wit and common-sense earthiness that grounded the king in the realities of ordinary English life. Louise de Keroualle brought French sophistication and diplomatic connections, while later favorites like Hortense Mancini added exotic continental glamour to the royal collection. The management of these multiple relationships required considerable diplomatic skill, as Charles had to balance the competing demands of women who were accustomed to being the center of attention and who possessed the intelligence and resources to make his life difficult if they felt neglected. The king developed elaborate protocols for managing his romantic schedule, ensuring that each mistress received appropriate attention while preventing the kind of public confrontations that might damage either his reputation or theirs. These arrangements were facilitated by a network of courtiers who served as intermediaries, carrying messages between the royal apartments and helping to coordinate the complex logistics of multiple simultaneous affairs. The physical arrangements at Whitehall reflected the king's commitment to providing his mistresses with the luxury and dignity that their position deserved. Each favorite was granted her own suite of apartments, decorated according to her personal taste and maintained at royal expense. These rooms became centers of cultural activity where artists, writers, and musicians gathered to enjoy the patronage of women who had gained wealth and influence through their relationships with the king. The result was a flowering of creativity that made Charles's court one of the most brilliant in Europe, a place where beauty and intelligence were celebrated regardless of their origins. But perhaps most remarkable was the way Charles managed to maintain genuine affection for his former mistresses even after their romantic relationships had ended. Unlike monarchs who typically discarded their favorites once novelty wore off, Charles continued to provide financial support and emotional friendship to women who had shared his bed and his secrets. Barbara Palmer remained a fixture at court long after their physical relationship had cooled, while Nell Gwyn could count on royal protection and generosity until her death. This loyalty created a sense of security that encouraged other women to seek royal attention, knowing that the king's favor, once earned, would not be arbitrarily withdrawn. The king's children by his various mistresses were acknowledged and provided for with a generosity that reflected Charles's genuine affection for both their mothers and them personally. These royal bastards were given titles, estates, and positions at court that made them prominent figures in English society, while their mothers were elevated to ranks that allowed them to participate fully in the social and political life of the kingdom. The Duke of Monmouth, Charles's son by Lucy Walter, became one of the most popular figures in England, while the children of Barbara Palmer and Louise de Keroualle established aristocratic lines that would play important roles in English history for generations to come. The religious implications of Charles's lifestyle added another layer of complexity to his reign, as he attempted to balance his personal inclinations with the expectations of a strongly Protestant nation. The king's private sympathies lay with Catholicism, the faith of his mother and many of his mistresses, but political necessity required him to maintain at least the appearance of Anglican orthodoxy. This religious ambiguity was reflected in his relationships, as he found himself torn between mistresses who represented different theological traditions and who used their influence to advance competing religious agendas. The most dramatic example of this religious tension was his relationship with Louise de Keroualle, a French Catholic whose presence at court was viewed with suspicion by Protestant politicians who feared French influence over English policy. Charles's obvious affection for Louise, combined with his grants of money and estates that seemed to flow directly from the English treasury to French interests, created a political crisis that threatened to undermine the religious settlement that had been established at the Restoration. The king's attempts to balance his personal feelings with political necessity revealed the continuing difficulty of reconciling private desire with public responsibility. The social changes that Charles's example encouraged were perhaps more significant than the immediate political implications of his relationships. By treating his mistresses with respect and providing them with genuine power and influence, the king challenged traditional assumptions about women's roles in society and politics. The success of figures like Nell Gwyn, who rose from selling oranges in the theatre to become one of the most influential women in England, demonstrated that intelligence and beauty could overcome the barriers of birth and education in ways that would have been impossible under previous regimes. The literary and artistic culture that flourished around Charles's court reflected this new openness to previously marginalized voices and perspectives. Playwrights like William Wycherley and George Etheredge created comedies that celebrated sexual freedom and social mobility, while poets like John Dryden wrote verses that praised the kind of sophisticated pleasure-seeking that the king embodied. The result was a cultural renaissance that rivaled the achievements of the Elizabethan era, but with a distinctly modern sensibility that emphasized individual fulfillment over collective duty. But the financial cost of maintaining multiple households and providing for numerous mistresses and their children placed considerable strain on the royal treasury and became a source of ongoing tension with Parliament. Critics argued that the king's personal expenses consumed resources that should have been devoted to national defense or economic development, while supporters countered that the cultural vitality of Charles's court more than justified its cost. These debates reflected deeper disagreements about the proper role of monarchy in English society and the extent to which royal behavior should be subject to public scrutiny. The international implications of Charles's relationships were equally complex, as foreign powers attempted to use his mistresses as channels for influencing English policy. French agents cultivated Louise de Keroualle as a means of maintaining the Anglo-French alliance, while Dutch diplomats sought to counter this influence through their connections with other royal favorites. The result was a form of international relations conducted through the royal bedchamber, where the personal preferences of the king's mistresses could affect the balance of power in Europe. As Charles aged, his approach to relationships evolved from the passionate intensity of his early years to a more measured appreciation of companionship and intellectual stimulation. The king continued to take new mistresses, but these later relationships tended to be based more on friendship and shared interests than on purely physical attraction. This maturation reflected his growing understanding of his own emotional needs and his recognition that the responsibilities of kingship required partnerships that could provide support and stability rather than merely excitement and novelty. The end came in February 1685, when Charles suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and struggling to speak. His deathbed was surrounded by the women who had shared his life and his throned former mistresses who had put aside their rivalries to provide comfort in his final hours, current favorites who refused to leave his side, and even his long-suffering Queen Catherine, who had learned to accept her husband's nature and who demonstrated genuine grief at his passing. The scene was a fitting end to a reign that had celebrated the complexity of human relationships and the possibility of finding love and loyalty in unexpected places. Charles's death marked the end of an era in English history, as his brother James II brought to the throne a very different understanding of royal responsibility and personal morality. The court culture that had flourished under the merry monarch with its emphasis on wit, beauty, and sexual freedom gave way to a more austere and religiously orthodox atmosphere that left little room for the kind of sophisticated pleasure-seeking that had characterized the Restoration. The mistresses who had once wielded considerable influence found themselves marginalized or exiled, while the artistic and literary figures who had thrived under royal patronage were forced to seek new sources of support. In the quiet hours before dawn, when London fog drifts through the ancient courtyards of Whitehall and the Thames reflects the pale light of approaching day, some claim they can still hear the echo of laughter and music from Charles's court, the sound of a king who understood that life's pleasures were meant to be shared, that beauty and intelligence deserved to be celebrated regardless of their origins, and that the human heart's capacity for love could transcend the artificial barriers that society imposed on desire and affection. The Sun King's secret passages, Louis VI. In the glittering halls of Versailles, where every mirror reflected the radiance of absolute monarchy and every chandelier cast the golden light of royal magnificence across marble floors that had been polished to perfection, there ruled a king whose very existence was theatre and whose every gesture was calculated to inspire awe. Louis XIV. Sun King had transformed the art of being royal into something approaching religious devotion, creating a court where ceremony and spectacle masked the most elaborate system of sexual intrigue in European history. For 72 years, this most magnificent of monarchs would demonstrate that absolute power could reshape not only the political landscape of Europe, but the very nature of desire itself. Louis's approach to sexuality was inseparable from his understanding of kingship, both reflecting his belief that the monarch's will should be the organizing principle around which all human activity revolved. From his earliest years on the throne, the young king had understood that his marriages, his love affairs, and even his casual flirtations were matters of state that could affect the balance of power throughout Europe. Yet, rather than allowing political necessity to constrain his personal desires, Louis developed a system that allowed him to pursue his appetites while simultaneously using them to strengthen royal authority and maintain the complex web of relationships that held his court together. The physical environment of Versailles was designed to facilitate the king's romantic adventures while maintaining the dignity and mystery that absolute monarchy required. The palace's infamous network of secret passages and hidden staircases allowed Louis to move unseen between the apartments of his various lovers, while specially designed chambers provided settings for intimate encounters that combined luxury with discretion. These architectural innovations were more than mere conveniences. They were the physical manifestation of a royal philosophy that treated love as another tool of statecraft and sexual conquest as a form of political control. The most famous of Louis's relationships was his long liaison with Madame de Montespan, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her sharp intelligence and ruthless ambition. Françoise Athénaïs had arrived at court as the wife of the Marquis de Montespan, but her wit and stunning blonde beauty quickly attracted the attention of a king who was growing bored with his current mistress, Louise de la Vallière. The courtship that followed was conducted according to the elaborate protocols of Versailles, where even the most passionate emotions had to be expressed through the coded language of ceremony and etiquette. Montespan's ascension to the position of maîtresse en titre required the careful displacement of La Vallière, a process that revealed Louis's sophisticated understanding of court psychology and feminine rivalry. Rather than simply dismissing his former favorite, the king orchestrated a gradual transition that allowed both women to maintain their dignity while ensuring that the change in royal affections would strengthen rather than weaken his position. The result was a love triangle that became the center of court attention for several years, with courtiers carefully observing every gesture and glance for clues about the king's current preferences and future intentions. But it was Montespan's pregnancy that revealed the true complexity of Louis's approach to royal sexuality. The birth of royal bastards was nothing new in French history, but Louis's decision to acknowledge his illegitimate children and provide them with honors and positions traditionally reserved for legitimate princes represented a revolutionary expansion of royal prerogative. The king's willingness to elevate his mistress's children to ranks that rivaled those of foreign royalty demonstrated that absolute monarchy could reshape not only law and custom, but the very definition of family itself. The logistics of maintaining multiple relationships while preserving the fiction of royal marriage required careful coordination that involved dozens of courtiers, servants, and confidants. The king's valet de chambre became experts at managing a schedule that allowed Louis to fulfill his dynastic obligations to Queen Marie-Thérèse while providing appropriate attention to his various mistresses and their children. These domestic arrangements were facilitated by the elaborate etiquette of Versailles, which created numerous opportunities for brief encounters and coded communications that appeared to be normal court interactions to casual observers. The apartments that Louis provided for his mistresses within Versailles became centers of political and cultural activity that rivaled the official court in their influence over royal policy. Montespan's salon attracted the finest writers, artists, and philosophers of the age, while her political opinions carried weight that many ministers envied. The king would often conduct informal governmental business in these private settings, discussing matters of state, while enjoying the company of women whose intelligence and beauty provided relief from the ceremonial demands of public monarchy. But perhaps most remarkable was the way Louis managed to transform what could have been a source of scandal into a demonstration of royal magnificence. The king's relationships were conducted with such style and grandeur that they became part of the spectacle that was Versailles, evidence of a monarch whose appetites were as magnificent as his palace. Foreign visitors came to expect that any visit to the French court would include glimpses of the king's beautiful mistresses, while French courtiers competed for invitations to private entertainments where royal favorites might be observed in their full glory. The religious implications of Louis's lifestyle required careful management, as the most Christian king needed to balance his personal inclinations with his role as defender of Catholic orthodoxy. The solution was a form of compartmentalized morality that allowed the king to pursue his desires while maintaining his religious obligations through elaborate acts of penance and devotion. Louis would attend Mass daily, contribute generously to religious charities, and even periodically attempt to reform his personal behavior. But these spiritual exercises were understood to be temporary interruptions rather than permanent changes to his fundamental nature. The most dramatic example of this religious tension occurred during the king's involvement with Montespan in what became known as the Affair of the Poisons, a scandal that revealed the extent to which court intrigue could merge with occult practices and criminal behavior. When investigations revealed that Montespan had consulted fortune-tellers and possibly participated in black masses designed to maintain her hold over the king's affections, Louis faced a crisis that threatened to expose the dark underbelly of his glittering court. His response protecting his mistress, while quietly distancing himself from her, demonstrated the sophisticated political calculations that governed even his most intimate relationships. The transition from Montespan to Madame de Maintenon represented not merely a change in royal affections, but an evolution in Louis's understanding of his own emotional needs and political requirements. Where Montespan had offered passion and intellectual stimulation, Maintenon provided the steadier pleasures of companionship and spiritual guidance that appealed to a king who was beginning to feel the weight of his years and the burden of his responsibilities. The secret marriage that may have taken place between Louis and Maintenon reflected his recognition that even absolute monarchs needed emotional anchors that could provide stability in an increasingly complex world. But Maintenon's influence over the aging king created new forms of court intrigue, as ambitious courtiers learned that access to royal favor now required winning the approval of a woman whose religious convictions and moral standards were very different from those of previous royal mistresses. The result was a gradual transformation of Versailles from a center of sophisticated pleasure-seeking to a more austere environment, where piety and propriety became the keys to advancement. This change reflected Louis's own spiritual evolution, but it also demonstrated the extent to which royal sexuality could reshape the cultural atmosphere of an entire nation. The financial cost of maintaining the elaborate system of royal relationships was staggering, involving not only the direct expenses of housing and entertaining multiple mistresses, but the broader economic impact of a court culture that prioritized luxury and display over practical considerations. The palaces, gardens, and entertainment facilities that Louis created to provide appropriate settings for his romantic adventures consumed resources that might have been devoted to military preparations or economic development, contributing to the fiscal crisis that would eventually undermine royal authority in France. The impact of Louis's example on French society was equally significant, as the elaborate system of royal sexuality that he created at Versailles influenced attitudes toward marriage, family, and relationships throughout the kingdom. The king's ability to maintain multiple simultaneous relationships while preserving his religious and political standing provided a model that French aristocrats attempted to emulate, creating a culture of sophisticated adultery that became one of the defining characteristics of Ancien Régime society. The international implications of Louis's relationships were also considerable, as foreign powers attempted to use his mistresses as channels for influencing French policy. English agents cultivated relationships with women who had access to the king's private chambers, while Austrian diplomats sought to counter French influence by providing intelligence about royal favorites to Louis's enemies. The result was a form of international espionage conducted through the royal bedchamber, where the personal preferences of the king's mistresses could affect the outcome of European wars. The artistic and literary culture that flourished around Louis's court reflected this sophisticated understanding of the relationship between power and desire. Writers like Racine and Molière created works that explored the psychological complexity of royal relationships, while artists like Lebrun painted portraits that captured both the beauty of royal mistresses and the magnificence of the court that surrounded them. These cultural productions served to legitimize and celebrate a system of royal sexuality that might otherwise have been seen as merely scandalous. As Louis aged, his approach to relationships became more complex and reflective, incorporating lessons learned from decades of experience with the pleasures and dangers of absolute power. The king's later years were marked by a growing awareness of mortality and a desire to ensure that his personal relationships would not undermine the stability of the monarchy that would survive him. This led to a more careful and conservative approach to romantic involvements, though Louis never entirely abandoned the belief that royal sexuality was an expression of divine authority rather than human weakness. The end came in September 1715, when Louis finally succumbed to the gangrenous infection that had tormented his final weeks. His deathbed was attended by Maintenon and other women who had shared his life and his throne. Their presence, a final testament to the king's belief that love and power were inseparable aspects of absolute monarchy. The scene was both intimate and ceremonial, reflecting the complex nature of a reign that had transformed personal desire into political theatre and romantic love into an instrument of royal authority. Louis's death marked the end of an era in European history, as his successors would find it impossible to maintain the elaborate system of royal sexuality that he had created. The court culture that had flourished at Versailles, with its emphasis on sophisticated pleasure-seeking and the celebration of royal desire, would gradually give way to more democratic and egalitarian ideals that questioned the very foundations of absolute monarchy. The mistresses who had once wielded considerable influence found themselves marginalized in a new world that valued different forms of power and authority. In the quiet hours before dawn, when morning mist drifts through the gardens of Versailles and the palace's empty halls echo with the memory of vanished splendor, some claim they can still hear the whispered conversations and gentle laughter of Louis's court, the sound of a king who understood that absolute power required not only political control, but emotional mastery, and who demonstrated that even the most magnificent throne was ultimately only as strong as the human relationships that supported it. PARC-AUX-CERFS. Whispers. Louis XVI. In the shadow of Versailles, where the Sun King's magnificent legacy cast both light and darkness across the French landscape, there stood a modest house in a quiet village that would become the most notorious address in Europe. The PARC-AUX-CERFS, literally the Deer Park, appeared to be nothing more than an elegant suburban residence where well-born young ladies might receive the kind of refined education that prepared them for advantageous marriages. In reality, it was the centerpiece of the most elaborate system of royal sexual procurement in history, a carefully organized institution that provided King Louis XV with a constant supply of beautiful young women, while maintaining the fiction that France's most Christian monarch was merely serving as patron to deserving maidens of good family. Louis XV had inherited more than a throne from his great-grandfather. He had also inherited the expectation that royal sexuality would be conducted on a scale and with a sophistication that matched the grandeur of absolute monarchy. But where the Sun King had managed his affairs with the theatrical flair that characterized everything about his reign, Louis XV approached his desires with a secretiveness that reflected both his naturally shy temperament and his growing awareness that public opinion was becoming less tolerant of royal excess. The result was a system of sexual gratification that was simultaneously more elaborate and more hidden than anything Europe had previously seen. The creation of the PARC-AUX-CERFS represented the culmination of decades of experimentation with different approaches to managing royal desire. By the 1750s, Louis had already exhausted the possibilities offered by traditional royal mistresses, women like Madame de Pompadour, who combined beauty with intelligence and political acumen, but who also brought their own agendas and complications to royal relationships. What the king desired was something simpler and more controllable: access to young women who would provide physical satisfaction without the emotional or political entanglements that had made his previous relationships so complex and demanding. The house itself was designed to project an image of respectable domesticity that would deflect suspicion about its true purpose. Located in a fashionable district of Versailles, it featured the kind of elegant but understated architecture that wealthy merchants might choose for their daughters' education. The gardens were arranged to provide privacy without appearing fortress-like, while the interior was decorated with the refined taste that characterized the best educational establishments of the period. Visitors who were not privy to its secrets would have seen nothing more remarkable than a well-appointed boarding school where young ladies of good family received instruction in music, dancing, and the social graces that would prepare them for successful marriages. But behind this facade of educational respectability lay a system of procurement and preparation that operated with the efficiency of a military organization. Young women, typically between the ages of 14 and 18, were recruited from across France through a network of agents who specialized in identifying candidates who combined beauty with the kind of social vulnerability that would make them unlikely to cause problems for their royal patron. These recruiters looked for girls whose families were respectable enough to provide the appearance of propriety, but desperate enough to accept the financial incentives that came with enrollment in this unusual academy. The selection process itself was conducted with the same attention to detail that other monarchs might devote to choosing ministers or generals. Potential candidates were evaluated not only for their physical attractiveness but for their temperament, their family background, and their likely discretion about the true nature of their education. Those who passed this initial screening were invited to visit the PARC-AUX-CERFS for what was described as an entrance examination, during which they would be observed by experts who could assess their suitability for the specific demands of royal service. Once accepted into the program, the young women entered a world that combined genuine educational opportunities with preparation for their ultimate purpose as royal companions. They received instruction in literature, music, and languages from some of the finest teachers in France, while also learning the more specialized skills that would allow them to please a king whose tastes had been refined by decades of experience with the most sophisticated women in Europe. These lessons covered everything from conversation and deportment to more intimate arts that were taught by experienced courtesans who understood the specific preferences and expectations of their royal client. The daily routine at the PARC-AUX-CERFS was carefully structured to maintain the fiction of educational propriety while preparing its residents for their eventual encounters with the king. The young women would rise early for prayers and breakfast, attend morning classes in academic subjects, spend their afternoons learning musical instruments or practicing dance, and conclude their days with instruction in the social graces that would allow them to hold their own in sophisticated company. This schedule was punctuated by regular visits from physicians who ensured their health, confessor priests who maintained their spiritual well-being, and etiquette masters who refined their manners to meet royal standards. But underlying this facade of educational respectability was a system of psychological preparation that was designed to ensure the young women's compliance with their ultimate fate. They were gradually made aware that their patron was a person of the highest rank, whose identity must never be revealed, while being encouraged to feel grateful for the opportunity to serve someone so exalted. The combination of genuine educational benefits, material comfort, and carefully cultivated awe for their mysterious benefactor created a psychological environment where resistance to royal desires became almost unthinkable. The physical arrangements for the king's visits were managed with the same attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the operation. Louis would arrive at the PARC-AUX-CERFS through secret passages that connected it to the palace complex, allowing him to maintain his encounters without being observed by the courtiers who monitored his every public movement. The house's interior had been modified to include specially designed chambers that could be quickly prepared for royal visits, with furniture that could be rearranged to create different atmospheric effects and hidden alcoves where servants could wait without intruding on the proceedings. The king's selection of companions from among the PARC-AUX-CERFS residents was governed by a complex system of rotation that ensured variety while preventing any individual from developing the kind of emotional attachment that might complicate future arrangements. Louis would typically spend several hours with each chosen companion, during which he would combine physical intimacy with conversation and musical entertainment that allowed him to assess their personality and intelligence. Those who proved particularly compatible with his tastes might be invited for repeat visits, while others would be gently returned to the general population of the house. The financial arrangements that supported this system were staggering in their scope and complexity. The PARC-AUX-CERFS required not only the obvious expenses of maintaining a large household, but also the costs of providing dowries for residents who had completed their service, supporting any children who resulted from royal encounters, and maintaining the network of agents who recruited suitable candidates from across France. These expenses were hidden within the larger budget of the royal household, but they represented a significant drain on resources that might have been devoted to more productive purposes. Perhaps most disturbing was the system's provision for dealing with the consequences of the king's visits. Young women who became pregnant during their residency were quietly removed from the PARC-AUX-CERFS and provided with comfortable accommodations where they could give birth in secrecy. Their children were typically placed with carefully chosen foster families who were compensated for their discretion, while the mothers themselves were given generous dowries and arranged marriages that would provide them with respectable futures far from the court. This systematic approach to managing royal bastards represented a bureaucratization of illegitimacy that was unprecedented in its efficiency and scope. The psychological impact on the young women who passed through this system was profound and varied. Some seemed to thrive in the environment of luxury and education that the PARC-AUX-CERFS provided, genuinely grateful for opportunities that would have been unavailable to them in their original circumstances. Others struggled with the moral implications of their situation, finding themselves torn between appreciation for material benefits and awareness that they were participating in arrangements that their religious education had taught them to consider sinful. The most tragic cases involved young women who developed genuine emotional attachments to the king during their brief encounters with him. Louis's natural charm and the obvious loneliness that lay beneath his royal persona could inspire feelings of protectiveness and affection that made the temporary nature of their relationships particularly painful. These women faced the impossible task of loving someone they could never truly know, whose identity was supposed to remain a mystery even as they shared the most intimate moments with him. The broader impact of the PARC-AUX-CERFS on French society was equally complex. Knowledge of its existence was widespread among the educated classes, creating a source of scandal that undermined respect for royal authority, while simultaneously fascinating those who were intrigued by the sophistication of its operations. The system represented both the ultimate expression of absolute monarchy's power over its subjects' lives and a demonstration of the extent to which even absolute power required elaborate deceptions to maintain its legitimacy. The religious implications of the PARC-AUX-CERFS created particular difficulties for a monarch who was supposed to serve as the eldest son of the Catholic Church. Louis's confessor and other church officials found themselves in the impossible position of trying to provide spiritual guidance to a king whose lifestyle violated fundamental Christian teachings about sexuality and marriage. The compromises that they developed emphasizing the king's charitable support for the young women involved, while minimizing discussion of the sexual aspects of the arrangements, revealed the extent to which even religious authority could be corrupted by proximity to absolute power. The international reaction to stories about the PARC-AUX-CERFS varied according to the political relationships between France and other European powers. Enemy nations used accounts of the system as propaganda to demonstrate French decadence and moral corruption, while Allied countries found themselves in the awkward position of having to ignore or minimize reports that might damage their relationships with the French crown. The result was a form of diplomatic hypocrisy that reflected the broader challenges of conducting international relations with monarchs whose personal behavior fell short of public expectations. As Louis aged, and the costs of maintaining the PARC-AUX-CERFS system continued to mount, criticism of the arrangement became more open and politically damaging. Pamphlets appeared in Paris describing the house's operations in detail, while satirical poems mocked the king's need for institutional support in his pursuit of young women. These attacks reflected growing public dissatisfaction with royal excess at a time when France faced serious financial and military challenges that required more focused leadership. The final years of the PARC-AUX-CERFS were marked by the king's declining interest in its services and his growing awareness that the system had become more of a political liability than a source of personal satisfaction. The elaborate machinery of procurement and preparation that had once seemed like the ultimate expression of royal privilege now felt like a burden that tied him to arrangements he no longer found particularly rewarding. The aging monarch's gradual withdrawal from the system reflected his growing preoccupation with mortality and his belated recognition that some forms of pleasure carried costs that extended far beyond their immediate financial implications. The end came in 1774 with Louis XV's death from smallpox, a disease that was widely interpreted as divine judgment on a king who had violated so many of the moral principles that supposedly governed Christian monarchy. The PARC-AUX-CERFS was quietly closed within months of his passing, its residents provided with final settlements and scattered across France to begin new lives far from the court that had shaped their youth. The house itself was converted to more conventional purposes, its secret passages sealed and its specially designed chambers restored to normal domestic use. The legacy of the PARC-AUX-CERFS extended far beyond its immediate impact on the individuals who had been involved in its operations. The system represented the logical endpoint of absolute monarchy's claim to unlimited authority over its subjects' lives, demonstrating that even the most intimate human relationships could be bureaucratized and systematized when sufficient power and resources were available. But it also revealed the ultimate emptiness of such arrangements, showing that institutional solutions to personal loneliness could never provide the genuine human connection that even absolute monarchs needed for their emotional well-being. The young women who had passed through the PARC-AUX-CERFS carried its influence with them for the rest of their lives, many struggling to form normal relationships after their early experiences with institutionalized sexuality. Some found happiness in the marriages that had been arranged for them, while others remained permanently marked by their brief encounters with royal power. Their stories, fragmentary and often difficult to verify, provide glimpses into the human cost of a system that treated individual lives as mere instruments for satisfying royal desires. In the quiet hours before dawn, when morning light filters through the windows of the modest house that once sheltered the PARC-AUX-CERFS, locals still claim they can hear the whispered conversations and muffled tears of long-dead residents' ghostly echoes of young women who had been caught up in the machinery of absolute power and who had paid the price for a base king's inability to distinguish between love and possession, between genuine intimacy and carefully orchestrated performance. Their memory serves as a reminder that even the most sophisticated systems of control ultimately fail to satisfy the human heart's need for authentic connection, and that the abuse of power, no matter how elaborately disguised, leaves wounds that can never fully heal.